Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, what if I told you that long before the United States existed, North America was home to vast cities filled with thousands, even tens of thousands, of people? These weren't small villages scattered across the wilderness. They were thriving centers with towering earthen monuments, bustling trade networks, skilled engineers, and complex societies that flourished for centuries. Yet today, most people have never heard their names. How could entire cities disappear so completely that they were nearly erased from popular memory? What happened to the people who built them? And why are archaeologists still uncovering discoveries that challenge long-held assumptions about North America's ancient past? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we'll travel back through time to explore the rise, glory, and mysterious decline of the forgotten cities that existed long before America was born. We'll separate myth from evidence and uncover the remarkable stories hidden beneath forests, fields, and modern towns. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's journey into the lost world of North America's forgotten civilizations. There is something resting beneath the surface of this vast land, something most written accounts choose to overlook. And I do not speak in riddles or metaphors here. I mean this quite literally, with absolute physical truth. Buried deep within the earth are stones the size of small homes, arranged with a geometrical accuracy that would challenge even our modern builders. Walls that stretch for miles, hidden within forests so thick that they went unnoticed for centuries. Chambers tucked below the ground, positioned with such care that on the darkest day of the year, a beam of sunlight reaches the farthest wall, and it stays there for exactly 4 minutes. It happens year after year, century after century, long before the first European ships are said to have graced these shores, before any of the civilizations our textbooks claim existed here were supposed to have taken root. If you are listening to this as you drift towards sleep, then you understand exactly why I craft these stories. Perhaps you might consider subscribing, and if you feel so inclined, let me know in the quiet of your mind where you are right now, and what time it is. There was something here long before the story we were all taught. Something that raised enormous works from stone and then either faded away or was so thoroughly scrubbed from the record that most people today have no clue these locations ever existed. And the most peculiar part is not that they are hidden in far-off jungles or beneath sheets of ice. Some of them are right there, visible on a casual afternoon drive through New England, sitting in plain view among the rolling hills of New Hampshire, the dense woods of Vermont, the peaceful farmland of upstate New York. Tourists walk right past them. Farmers guide their plows around them. Hikers step over them without a second glance, because they simply do not fit any narrative we were raised to expect. But once your eyes are opened, once you truly begin to search, you find you cannot stop. Mortarless stone chambers that have withstood the ages for thousands of years. Earthworks so immense they can only truly be appreciated from the sky. Standing stones that align with the sun and moon with a precision that would have required decades of careful, dedicated observation. Petroglyphs etched into rock faces, carrying scripts that remain undeciphered. And beneath it all, a persistent, quiet, endlessly intriguing question remains. Who raised these structures? When were they built? And why does the accepted version of American antiquity still maintain there is nothing to explain? That question is the real heart of this tale, not the answer. We do not have a neat answer. Anyone who tells you they possess a clear, neat answer is probably trying to sell you something. What we have instead is proof, tangible, measurable, datable proof of human activity in North America that simply does not align with the timeline we were given. And we have the stories, the oral histories, the persistent legends of people who inhabited this land for tens of thousands of years before Columbus, before the Vikings, before Jacques Cartier, before any name that appears in a Western history textbook. Stories of constructors, of stone masons, of people who came long before the people who came before. This is that tale, or at least as much of it as we can assemble right now, in this moment with the evidence we currently possess. It will be long. It deserves to be long. These places have earned that time. They have been waiting, most of them, for centuries just to be acknowledged. The least we can offer is our full attention. Let us begin at the start, or what we currently believe to be the start. The history of North America that most of us absorbed in school effectively starts with a void. Before the Europeans arrived, we are told there were various indigenous peoples living in various ways across the continent. Some were nomadic, some were agricultural, some built impressive things. Yes, like the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley or the cliff dwellers of the Southwest. But when it comes to monumental stone architecture, when it comes to the kind of massive, precisely built megalithic structures we associate with ancient Egypt or Stonehenge or the temples of Southeast Asia, the official narrative says there was nothing like that in North America. Nothing comparable, nothing that demands a serious rethinking of our understanding of who was here and when. That story has a comfortable shape. It draws a clean line between the old world, where all the impressive ancient marvels supposedly happened, and the new world, where people lived in harmony with nature in ways that were sophisticated and meaningful, but did not involve the systematic quarrying, moving, and stacking of enormous stones in exacting geometric patterns. The problem with that comfortable story is the stones themselves. They refuse to comply with it. In the hills of southern New Hampshire, about an hour north of Boston, there is a place that locals have known for generations by several different names. For most of the 20th century, it was called Mystery Hill. Today, it is called something else, a name deliberately chosen to provoke a specific set of questions. It is now called America's Stonehenge. That name is both fitting and somewhat deceptive, which is itself telling. It is fitting in the sense that the site truly consists of stone structures, standing stones, and astronomical alignments that function similarly to what you find at Stonehenge in England. The alignments track solstices and equinoxes. The stones are large and deliberately placed. The site has clearly been used over an extended period for purposes beyond simple shelter or storage. It is misleading in the sense that the site looks nothing like Stonehenge. Where Stonehenge is open, imposing, composed of massive upright stones arranged in clear circular patterns, America's Stonehenge is dense, maze-like, close to the ground, concealed beneath forest growth. You could walk within 100 feet of it and not realize it was there. The structures are mostly underground or at ground level. Chambers built from enormous flat stones laid horizontally, covered by capstones that in some cases weigh 4 tons or more. Narrow passages you have to crouch to enter. Drainage systems carved into the bedrock beneath the floors. A large flat stone with a groove running around its edge, positioned above what appears to be a speaking tube leading down into an underground chamber, which has led some researchers to speculate it may have been used as a sacrificial altar, where sounds and words spoken above could be heard from below, as if from the earth itself. The site covers about 30 acres. It has been dated multiple times by multiple researchers, using multiple methods, and the dates are deeply, profoundly inconvenient for the standard timeline. Charcoal found beneath stones at the site has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 200 BCE. A stone wall associated with the site has been dated using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures when minerals in stone were last exposed to sunlight, to approximately 2000 BCE as well. Two distinct techniques, consistent dates, roughly 4,000 years old. For context, 4,000 years ago in Europe, Stonehenge was being completed. The pyramids at Giza had just been built. In North America, according to the official timeline, There were no literate civilizations, no complex organized societies capable of quarrying and moving multi-ton stones with geometric precision. No settlements that required or produced the kind of long-term planning and communal labor that monumental construction demands. And yet, here are the stones. The most striking feature of America's Stonehenge for most visitors is not the underground chambers or the speaking tube altar or the drainage systems. Impressive as they all are, it is the standing stones arranged around the perimeter of the site that track astronomical events. There is a stone that aligns with sunrise on the summer solstice. There is a stone that aligns with sunset on the summer solstice. There are stones for the winter solstice sunrise and sunset, and stones for both the spring and autumn equinoxes. The alignments are accurate. They work. You can stand at the center of the site on December 21st and watch the sun set precisely over the winter solstice monolith. This is not an accident. Achieving this level of astronomical precision requires decades of systematic observation. You cannot do it in a single season or even a year. You have to observe the sun's movement across the sky over many years. You must mark where it rises and sets at different times of year. You choose your stone placements accordingly, and you must have a community stable enough and devoted enough to the project to sustain it over a long period of time. This is not the behavior of nomadic people passing through. This is the behavior of a settled community with advanced knowledge, long-term planning capabilities, and a deep cultural investment in tracking celestial events. Who were they? That question has no clear answer, which is partly why the site remains controversial. Some researchers have argued for pre-Columbian Celtic or Phoenician origins, pointing to what they interpret as Ogham script inscriptions found at and near the site. Ogham is an ancient writing system used in Ireland and parts of Britain, and several New England sites have stone inscriptions that at least some epigraphers have identified as Ogham text. The most prominent proponent of this theory was Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who in the 1970s published a book called America BC that laid out extensive evidence for pre-Columbian European contact with North America. Fell's work remains controversial. Mainstream archaeologists have largely dismissed it, arguing that what he interpreted as Ogham inscriptions are natural scratches in the rock or the marks of colonial-era plows. But the dismissal has never been entirely clean. Some of the inscriptions are in positions and orientations that make the plow theory implausible. Some of them contain what appear to be consistent characters rather than random marks. The debate has never been fully resolved, which means the question remains open. Other researchers have argued for indigenous origin, suggesting that the structures at America's Stonehenge were built by ancient Native American peoples who have since lost the specific traditions associated with the site. This theory has the advantage of not requiring any transoceanic contact and fits more comfortably within the existing archaeological framework for the region. The problem is that no specific indigenous tradition in the area claims these structures, and no oral history clearly describes their construction. That absence does not prove indigenous people did not build them, but it does make the theory harder to ground. What no serious researcher currently argues is that the site is recent. The dating evidence is too consistent, the engineering too deliberate, the astronomical alignments too accurate to be explained as a colonial farm or a modern fabrication. Something old is here. Something planned is here. Something that required sophisticated knowledge and sustained communal effort is here. And America's Stonehenge is just the beginning. Drive north from New Hampshire into Vermont, and you start to find them everywhere once you know what you are looking for. Stone chambers. Dozens of them scattered across the hills of New England, like the ruins of some civilization that nobody remembers. Vermont alone has more than 100 documented stone chambers. Connecticut has several dozen. Massachusetts has more. New York has them. The total number of documented megalithic stone chambers in New England runs well into the hundreds, and the undocumented ones that have not yet been formally surveyed likely push that number significantly higher. These are not modest structures. They are built from stones that weigh hundreds of pounds to several tons, arranged without mortar in the style known as dry stone construction. The largest capstones, the horizontal slabs that form the roofs, are among the most impressive engineering achievements in the entire region. Some of them could not be moved today without heavy equipment. They were placed with care, with precision, with an apparent understanding of how to distribute weight across a stone arch, so that the structure would remain stable for centuries without the need for cement or adhesive of any kind. The official explanation for most of these chambers, the one that appears in state historical guides and local Wikipedia pages and the materials put out by various historical societies, is that they are colonial root cellars, storage structures built by European farmers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to keep vegetables from freezing in winter. Farmers needed to store turnips and potatoes and carrots through the long New England winters, and they built stone chambers for that purpose. Mystery solved. The problem with this explanation, when you actually start examining specific chambers, is that it does not hold up to scrutiny in a significant number of cases. Root cellars need doors. They need to be accessible for the regular retrieval of stored food. They are typically oriented to limit heat loss, which means in the Northeast they are usually oriented with their openings facing south or southeast to take advantage of passive solar warmth and to minimize cold north wind penetration. They are usually located close to farmhouses because you do not want to walk half a mile in a February blizzard to get your turnips. They are typically of consistent size and construction style because they are serving the same basic utilitarian function. The stone chambers of New England fail these criteria in ways that are difficult to explain if the root cellar theory is correct. Many of them have openings oriented precisely at astronomical events. Chambers in Vermont, in Connecticut, in New York have their entrance passages aligned so that on the winter solstice, or the summer solstice, or one of the equinoxes, sunlight penetrates directly into the interior and strikes the back wall of the chamber. This is exactly what you find in confirmed ancient monuments around the world. The passage tomb at Newgrange in Ireland is aligned so that on the winter solstice sunrise, a beam of light travels down the entire length of the passage and illuminates the chamber at the back. Maeshowe in Orkney, Scotland, does the same thing. The alignment of these structures with solar events is understood to be deliberate and ancient. When you find the same phenomenon in Vermont stone chambers, the root cellar explanation becomes difficult to maintain. Nobody building a vegetable storage structure in the 18th century was aligning its entrance passage with the winter solstice sunrise. That is not a feature that helps you get your carrots. It is a feature that requires sophisticated astronomical knowledge, deliberate design, and a cultural significance that has nothing to do with food storage. One of the most studied of these chambers is a structure in central Vermont that sits on a hillside above a small farm. The chamber itself is about 15 feet long and 6 feet wide, constructed from flat stones fitted together with remarkable precision. The entrance passage faces southwest. On the day of the winter solstice, as the sun sets, a shaft of light enters the passage, travels its entire length, and illuminates a stone at the back of the chamber in a way that does not happen on any other day of the year. Researchers have watched and documented this phenomenon multiple times. It is consistent. It is precise, and the stones themselves, tested using thermoluminescence dating, have given dates ranging from 900 to 2,000 years before the present. 900 years at minimum, possibly 2,000 years. That means the most conservative dating puts the construction of this chamber in an era when New England was definitively not colonized by Europeans. The English did not arrive in significant numbers until the 1600s. The Norse exploration of the northeastern coast, which is now historically documented, occurred around 1000 CE. Neither of those timelines comes close to accounting for a chamber that was built somewhere between the years 20 and 1120 CE, long before any documented European presence in the interior of New England. And yet, the questions go deeper than just the chambers themselves. Running through New England, often passing near or connecting to the stone chambers, are networks of stone walls that cover thousands of miles. New England has more stone walls per square mile than almost anywhere on Earth. The total length of stone walls in the region has been estimated at over 100,000 miles. Most of these walls are explained, again, as the work of colonial farmers clearing their fields of stones and piling them along boundaries. This is true for many of them. 19th century New England farming created an enormous amount of fieldstone that needed to go somewhere, and stone walls were a logical solution. But not all of these walls are farmers' clearance walls. Some of them run through terrain that was never farmed, over ridgelines and through wetlands and along the tops of hills that no colonial farmer would have chosen to cultivate. Some of them are too precisely constructed to be casual field clearance work, with fitted stones and deliberate coursing that suggests skilled masonry rather than opportunistic piling. And some of them, when traced on maps, form patterns that are large enough and deliberate enough to suggest they were not just boundaries or clearance piles, but components of a larger designed landscape. The most dramatic example of this is a structure in Connecticut that researchers have been studying for decades, and that still does not have a fully satisfying explanation. It is a low stone wall that runs across a hill in a pattern that, when viewed from above or traced on a topographic map, describes a shape, not a random shape, a deliberate shape, one that some researchers have interpreted as representing a serpent with a distinct triangular head and a long, sinuous body that follows the contours of the hill. The structure is oriented astronomically. The head of the serpent is positioned to face the sunrise on a specific day of the year. This is not unique to Connecticut. Similar structures appear in other parts of the Northeast. Walls and arrangements of stones that form shapes visible only from above or when traced in their entirety. Shapes that appear to have astronomical or symbolic significance. They are much harder to date than the chambers because they sit on the surface and have been disturbed repeatedly. But they are consistent with a tradition of landscape modification that predates European colonization. Now let us move south and west, because the megalithic mystery of North America is not confined to New England. It is a continental phenomenon, and once you start tracing it across the map, the scale of what was here before the history we were taught becomes almost disorienting. In the Appalachian Mountains, running from Alabama north to Pennsylvania and beyond, there are hundreds of stone structures that do not appear in any archaeological catalog. Not because they have been examined and dismissed, but because they have never been examined at all. They sit on private land, or in national forests, or on hillsides that nobody has ever formally surveyed. And they wait there year after year while the trees grow over them and the moss fills the gaps between their stones. Some of these were discovered by accident. Hunters following deer into a hollow. Hikers cutting cross-country off-trail. Farmers expanding a field and hitting a stone wall that keeps going far further than any reasonable field boundary should. Others were found by people specifically looking for them, researchers and enthusiasts who had heard about the New England chambers and gone looking to see if the phenomenon extended further south. It does. In the hills of western North Carolina, in the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee, in the forested ridges of western Virginia, there are stone structures that match the New England chambers in their basic design. Dry stone construction, massive capstones, passages oriented toward astronomical events. A chamber in western North Carolina has an entrance passage that admits the light of the setting winter solstice sun in a way that precisely mirrors what the Vermont chambers do. A structure in Tennessee consists of a series of interconnected stone enclosures whose overall dimensions and orientation suggest deliberate astronomical design. These sites have not received anywhere near the attention they deserve. They are not famous. They are not tourist destinations. They are not in any guidebook. In many cases, they are known only to a handful of local people and a small network of amateur researchers who have been quietly documenting them for years without institutional support or mainstream recognition. The archaeology establishment has largely not engaged with them because they do not fit into any recognized cultural category. They are not associated with any known archaeological culture. They do not match the material culture of any documented indigenous group in the region. They are, in the technical language of archaeology, anomalous. And anomalies in a field that depends on pattern recognition and cultural categorization are uncomfortable things to deal with. So they wait. Go further south into Alabama and Georgia, and you encounter a different order of mystery entirely. The mound builders of the American Southeast are not unknown to mainstream archaeology. They are in fact one of the most studied topics in North American prehistory. Cultures like the Adena and Hopewell in the Ohio Valley, and later the Mississippian culture that built Cahokia near what is now St. Louis, constructed earthen mounds on a scale that rivals anything in the ancient world. Cahokia's Monk's Mound is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The earthworks of the Hopewell culture cover thousands of square miles of the Ohio Valley in geometric patterns of extraordinary precision. Circles and octagons and parallel walls align to the movements of the moon. These are documented. These are accepted. These are in the textbooks, even if they are not given nearly the attention they deserve relative to their actual scale and sophistication. But alongside the known mound builder cultures, there are other things. Things that are older, stranger, and less easily categorized. In Alabama, there is a site called Manitou Stone that most people outside the region have never heard of. It consists of a large natural stone around which someone at some point in the past constructed a series of stone features, including alignments and what appear to be carved symbols. The age of the construction is uncertain. The cultural affiliation is unknown. Local indigenous oral traditions describe it as ancient, as having been there since before memory, which in the context of Native American oral tradition means genuinely old, because these traditions routinely preserve accurate memory of geological and climatic events going back thousands of years. In Georgia, the Etowah Mound site contains not just the large platform mounds for which it is famous, but also a network of earthworks and stone features that extend beyond the main ceremonial complex into the surrounding landscape. The relationships between these features and the main site have never been fully mapped. The dating of some of the outlying stone features suggests they are older than the main mound complex, which would mean they predate the Mississippian culture that built the central mounds by centuries. What was here before the Mississippian culture? What were those earlier people building, and why? These are questions that the archaeological record raises but does not clearly answer. Partly because the later Mississippian constructions overlie and disturb the earlier features, and partly because systematic excavation of the site has never been completed. The longer you spend with the archaeology of North America, the more you realize how much of it is unexcavated. The continent is vast. The potential site density is enormous. The resources available for professional archaeology are limited. And the political and cultural complications of excavating sites that may be associated with the ancestors of living indigenous peoples add layers of complexity that often bring work to a halt before it produces clear results. So the ground holds its secrets. Let us talk about a site that is not at all unknown, that has been studied extensively, that appears in textbooks, and that still raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Poverty Point in northeastern Louisiana was built approximately 3,500 years ago. It consists of a series of massive earthen ridges arranged in a pattern of concentric half rings, open on one side toward a creek. The ridges are not simple mounds. They are long raised platforms, each one several feet high and stretching for hundreds of yards, arranged with geometric precision. The overall structure, viewed from above, looks like a series of nested parentheses. The largest earthwork on the site, Mound A, is a massive platform mound more than 70 feet high. The total volume of earth moved to create the Poverty Point complex has been estimated at more than 50 million cubic feet. To To put that in perspective, 50 million cubic feet of earth moved by hand, using baskets and digging sticks, in a society that supposedly had no agriculture, no domesticated draft animals, and no metal tools. The people who built Poverty Point were, according to the standard classification, late archaic hunter-gatherers. They were not supposed to have the social organization, the labor surplus, the long-term settlement stability, or the cultural motivation to undertake construction projects of this scale. And yet they did. The physical evidence is there. The site exists. It has been dated. It was definitely built approximately 3,500 years ago. The question is not whether it exists, but how and by whom, and in what cultural and organizational context. The standard explanation has evolved over the decades. Where early researchers assumed the site must have been built by some form of chiefdom with strong, centralized authority commanding large workforces. More recent research has suggested that the construction may have been more episodic, with large gatherings of people periodically contributing labor to the project over many generations. This is the model that currently has the most scholarly support, and it has the advantage of not requiring an entirely invisible complex political hierarchy. But it raises its own questions. What brought large numbers of people to this specific location repeatedly over many generations? What was the cultural and ritual significance of the site that motivated sustained communal investment in its construction? How did the builders maintain the geometric precision of the concentric ridges across multiple generations of construction? And what was the relationship between Poverty Point and the other sites in the broader regional network? Because Poverty Point did not exist in isolation. There are subsidiary sites spread across hundreds of miles of the Mississippi Valley that appear to have been connected to Poverty Point through trade and cultural exchange. Objects found at Poverty Point have been traced to source materials from as far away as the Great Lakes and the Rocky Mountains. This is a trade network covering thousands of miles, operated by people who are supposedly simple hunter-gatherers with no complex social organization. It implies a level of long-distance communication, exchange, and cultural connection that should have left more traces in the archaeological record than it has. Where are the other nodes of this network? Where are the construction sites of the people who supplied the exotic materials that end up at Poverty Point? Some of those sites have been found. Others remain undiscovered or undocumented. The picture is fragmentary in ways that make the larger story hard to reconstruct. Now, we need to talk about something that mainstream archaeology finds deeply uncomfortable and that alternative researchers have built elaborate theories around. We need to talk about pre-Columbian contact between North America and the rest of the world. Not the Norse contact, which is documented and accepted. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland is real. The Norse were in northeastern North America around 1000 CE. That is established history, but it was a brief settlement. It did not significantly influence the surrounding indigenous cultures, and it ended relatively quickly. The Norse contact is interesting, but it does not explain the New England chambers, most of which predate it, and it does not explain the Poverty Point trade network, which predates it by 2,500 years. What is being discussed in the more radical literature, and what is supported by a growing body of genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence that has not yet been fully integrated into the mainstream picture, is the possibility of earlier, more sustained, more culturally significant contact between North America and various other parts of the world. Celtic and Phoenician contact with the northeastern coast, Polynesian contact with the Pacific coast, possible early African contact with the Gulf Coast and Caribbean, possible Australian or Melanesian contact with the Pacific coast in the very deep past. Some of these theories have more evidence behind them than others. The genetic evidence for Polynesian contact with the Americas is now quite strong. Studies of both plant genetics and human genetics have established that there was contact between Polynesian peoples and the indigenous peoples of South America in the centuries before Columbus. The sweet potato, a South American crop, appears in Polynesia centuries before European contact. Genetic markers in coastal South American indigenous peoples show Polynesian contribution. The Polynesian word for sweet potato and the Quechua word for it are close enough to suggest direct borrowing rather than coincidence. This is not contested. This is in the scientific literature, and the evidence is solid. What is less settled is the full extent of Polynesian contact with North America specifically, and its cultural impact on the peoples of the Pacific coast. Some researchers have argued that certain architectural and artistic traditions of the Pacific Northwest show Polynesian influence. Others have pointed to stone structures on certain Pacific coast islands that are inconsistent with the known traditions of the local indigenous peoples, but consistent with Polynesian construction methods. The Celtic contact theory, most famously argued by Barry Fell in America BC, is more controversial but harder to fully dismiss than mainstream archaeologists would prefer. The Ogham inscriptions found at multiple New England sites are the most concrete element of this theory, and the debate about whether they are genuine ancient inscriptions or natural features has never been cleanly resolved. But there is additional evidence that Fell did not fully emphasize. The design similarity between certain New England chamber structures and Irish and Scottish megalithic structures is striking enough that a number of professional archaeologists who study both traditions have noted the resemblance. The astronomical alignments at New England sites match those of Atlantic European megalithic sites in ways that go beyond coincidence. The trade goods found at some New England sites include materials that do not have obvious local sources and that have not been traced to documented indigenous trade networks. None of this proves Celtic settlement in New England, but it raises the question of whether contact, even brief and episodic contact, might account for some of the architectural and astronomical knowledge that appears to have been present in the region. The Phoenician theory is similarly contested. The Phoenicians were extraordinary sailors, the dominant maritime culture of the Mediterranean from approximately 1200 to 300 BCE, and they are known to have circumnavigated Africa, to have reached the British Isles and established trading contacts there, and to have maintained an extensive oceanic trading network that covered most of the known world. Some researchers have argued that they also reached the Americas, pointing to certain artifacts found in the Americas that appear to be of Phoenician origin, and to a Roman-era coin hoard found in New England that, if genuine, suggests ancient Mediterranean contact with the region. The coin hoard is particularly interesting because it was not discovered in a dramatic archaeological excavation that could be easily dismissed as selective reporting. It was turned up incrementally over many years on a farm property in Maine by different people at different times, and the coins span a range of Mediterranean cultures and time periods. Some of the coins have been authenticated by professional numismatists who found no evidence of modern fabrication. Others remain contested. The collection as a whole does not have a clean explanation that fits comfortably within the standard framework of American prehistory. Before we go deeper into the specific sites and their evidence, we need to spend some time with a question that runs underneath all. And third, the oral traditions. This is the piece of evidence that mainstream archaeology has been slowest to fully integrate, but that is increasingly being recognized as genuinely valuable. Indigenous peoples across North America have oral traditions that preserve memory of events going back thousands of years. These traditions have been demonstrated in multiple cases to preserve accurate information about geological and climatic events that can be independently verified. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describing the rising of sea levels after the last ice age have been shown to accurately describe events that occurred approximately 10,000 years ago. Similar oral preservation of deep-time geological events has been documented among indigenous peoples in North America. These same oral traditions describe, in many cases, not just the distant geological past, but the cultural past. They describe builders. They describe migrations. They describe the presence of other peoples, other cultures, peoples who were here before the ancestors of the storytellers arrived, or who arrived during historical memory and then departed or were absorbed. These stories have not been systematically compared to the growing body of archaeological and genetic evidence in a way that could potentially correlate them with specific sites or cultural events. That work remains largely undone, but the stories are there. They are specific, detailed, and consistent within their traditions in ways that suggest they preserve genuine historical memory rather than pure mythology. And they describe a North America that was far more complex, far more inhabited, far more connected to wider networks of human activity than the official history has ever suggested. Let us go to Ohio, because if you want to understand the true scale of what was built in ancient North America, if you want to grasp what the people who lived here were capable of constructing and what they understood about the world, you need to spend some time with the Newark earthworks. The Newark earthworks are by any measure one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. They are not well known outside of Ohio. They do not attract anything like the international attention they deserve, but they are, in terms of the sheer scale of their design and the sophistication of their astronomical knowledge, among the most impressive human constructions in the ancient world. The earthworks were built by the Hopewell culture, a complex archaeological tradition that flourished in the Ohio Valley from approximately 100 BCE to 500 CE. The Hopewell people were not a simple society. They operated a trading network covering millions of square miles, from the Gulf Coast to the northern Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountain foothills. Objects found at Hopewell sites have been traced to source materials from every corner of the continent. Copper from Michigan, obsidian from Wyoming, shark teeth from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians. This was a genuinely continental trading system, operating centuries before any Europeans set foot in North America. The Newark earthworks, in their original form before the 19th century development that destroyed much of them, covered an area of more than 4 square miles. They consisted of a series of geometric earthen enclosures, circles, octagons, parallel walls connected by long avenues, and linked to a great circle more than 1,000 feet in diameter. The precision of the geometric forms has been measured repeatedly by surveyors and engineers, and the conclusion is consistent. The angles in the octagonal enclosure are accurate to within a fraction of a degree. The circles are true circles, not approximate circles, to a level of precision that would require sophisticated measurement tools to achieve. The parallel walls that connect the various elements of the complex are exactly parallel to each other over distances of miles. How do you build parallel walls miles long with perfect precision using only hand tools? You can do it. It is not impossible, but it requires a sophisticated understanding of geometry and a systematic approach to surveying that most people would not associate with a pre-Columbian American culture. The astronomical alignments of the Newark earthworks are what truly set them apart. Detailed analysis by archaeoastronomer Ray Hively and philosopher Robert Horn, published in a peer-reviewed scientific paper in 1982, demonstrated that the Newark earthworks are precisely aligned to encode the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon. The Moon does not have a simple annual cycle the way the Sun does. Its rise and set points on the horizon change over a cycle of 18.6 years, reaching a maximum northerly and southerly extent, and then returning to a minimum. Tracking this cycle accurately requires making observations over a minimum of 18.6 years, and ideally across multiple cycles to confirm the pattern. The major and minor standstills of the Moon, the points of maximum and minimum extent in its cycle, are encoded in the geometric relationships between the various enclosures and avenues of the Newark earthworks. The alignments are not approximate. They are accurate to within the margin of error of natural topographic variation. The builders of Newark either had access to records of lunar observations going back at least 18.6 years, or they were continuing a tradition of observation that had begun long before the construction of the earthworks themselves. This level of astronomical knowledge does not spring up overnight. You do not wake up one morning and decide to encode an 18.6-year lunar cycle in your earthworks. You accumulate the necessary observational data over generations, build a mathematical framework for interpreting it, and then design a construction project that will encode it in permanent form. The knowledge base required to produce the Newark earthworks was the product of centuries of systematic observation and calculation. And the Newark earthworks, impressive as they are, represent only one node in a network of Hopewell sites spread across the Ohio Valley. The Hopewell Culture National Historical Park encompasses a complex of earthworks at Chillicothe, Ohio, that is similar in scale and sophistication to Newark. The Mound City Group includes a series of burial mounds within a large rectangular enclosure that served as a ceremonial center. The Sipe Earthworks, the High Bank Works, and the Hopeton Earthworks all preserve portions of what was once a landscape transformed by human design on a scale that beggars description. There were dozens, possibly hundreds, of Hopewell ceremonial sites in the Ohio Valley. Most are destroyed. The land that was covered by earthworks in ancient Ohio is now farmland. Suburban development, airports, parking lots. Monk's Mound at Cahokia, the largest single earthen structure in the ancient Americas, survives within a state park. Many of the smaller sites are simply gone, plowed under or built over without anyone having made systematic records of what was there. What we have left is fragmentary. What the fragments tell us, even in their fragmentary state, is astonishing. The people who built the Hopewell earthworks were not living the simple hand-to-mouth existence of the generic pre-Columbian hunter-gatherer that the popular imagination typically conjures. They were artists, engineers, astronomers, traders, and builders working at a continental scale. Let us go further west, into the Great Plains, which in our imaginations are empty, windswept, the territory of nomadic bison hunters. The reality of the archaeological record there is considerably more interesting. The Great Plains have stone features. Many of them. Most of them are called medicine wheels, which is a European term applied to circular stone arrangements found across the northern plains from Wyoming to Alberta. The most famous of these is the Bighorn Medicine Wheel in northern Wyoming. Located at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet in the Bighorn Mountains, a location so remote and inhospitable that reaching it even today requires a significant hike. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel consists of a central stone cairn surrounded by a ring of stones roughly 80 feet in diameter, with 28 stone spokes radiating from the center to the rim, and 6 smaller cairns positioned at various points around and beyond the outer ring. It has been used for spiritual ceremonies by Plains Indian peoples for as long as oral tradition extends, which means it has been used for a very long time. Its age has been estimated by various researchers at anywhere from 200 to 700 years, based on comparison with similar structures of known age. The estimates vary because the wheel is built from local limestone that is common throughout the area and does not retain information about when it was quarried or placed in the same way that some other materials do. What is interesting about the Bighorn Medicine Wheel from an archaeoastronomical perspective is that several of the cairns placed around the outer ring of the structure mark significant astronomical events. One cairn marks the direction of sunrise at the summer solstice. Another marks the heliacal rise of the star Aldebaran, the bright red star in the constellation Taurus. A third marks the heliacal rise of Rigel in Orion. A fourth marks the heliacal rise of Fomalhaut. These are not accidents. Heliacal rise, the moment when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before sunrise after a period of invisibility, was an important astronomical event in many ancient cultures. The heliacal rise of specific stars was used as a calendar, marking the times for planting, for harvest, for the beginning of seasonal migrations. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel encodes a sophisticated astronomical calendar that incorporates not just solar events, but stellar ones. The knowledge required to design this calendar predates the construction of the wheel by at least the period necessary to observe and verify the heliacal rise dates of the relevant stars. which requires at minimum several years of careful observation from a fixed location. And the Bighorn medicine wheel is not unique. There are more than 100 documented medicine wheels across the northern plains, ranging from simple circles of stones to complex arrangements with multiple cairns, spokes, and alignments. Some of them have been archaeoastronomically analyzed and show similar astronomical encoding. Others have not yet been studied in detail. Beyond the medicine wheels, the plains have other stone features that are less well known. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, there are large stone effigies, figures of humans and animals outlined in stone on the ground, visible only from above or when traced carefully on the surface. These are different from the mound effigies of the Midwest in that they are made from surface stones rather than built-up earth. But they are analogous in concept, large-scale figures designed to be meaningful across a landscape rather than from a single fixed viewpoint. Some of them are associated with specific stories in Indigenous oral traditions. Others have lost their associated stories through the disruptions of colonization and do not currently have clear cultural context. In the high plains of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, there are stone features called drive lines, long walls of stacked stones that converge on a killing area and were used to funnel bison herds into traps where they could be slaughtered efficiently. These are practical features, not ceremonial ones, but they represent a form of landscape engineering that required coordination among large groups of people over long periods of time. You do not build a drive line alone. You build it as a community, and you use it as a community, and you maintain it as a community across generations. The largest bison drive systems required hundreds of people working together to function, and they were used repeatedly over decades or centuries, which means the communities that used them had the stability and organization to maintain a shared technology across generations. Now let us go to the Southwest, because the American Southwest is where the megalithic mystery takes on a different character. One that is more dramatic, more visible, and in some ways more deeply studied and still full of unresolved questions. The ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, built things in the canyons and mesas of the Colorado Plateau that are still standing 1,000 years after their construction, and that still raise questions about how exactly they were built and what they were for. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon, the great houses of the San Juan Basin. These are not obscure sites. They have been studied for more than a century. They appear in every archaeology textbook, but familiarity has a way of making the truly strange things seem ordinary. And the truly strange things about these sites are easy to stop noticing once you have seen enough photographs. Chaco Canyon is the center of the ancestral Puebloan world, or at least the center of what is called the Chaco phenomenon. A brief but extraordinary fluorescence of culture and construction that occurred between approximately 850 and 1150 CE. In that 300-year period, the people of the San Juan Basin constructed a series of massive stone buildings, the Great Houses, that were unlike anything else being built in North America at the time and that have no clear archaeological precedent in the region. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco Great Houses, contains approximately 800 rooms and rises to 5 stories in places. It was built from a specific type of sandstone that had to be quarried from outcrops miles away and carried to the building site on human backs, because there were no wheeled vehicles and no domesticated draft animals in the American Southwest. The stone was prepared in a distinctive way, with thin tabular pieces fitted together with fine mortar to create walls of unusual smoothness and precision. The construction of Pueblo Bonito required the cutting, hauling, and placement of approximately 30,000 tons of sandstone. But the stone walls are only part of what makes Chaco extraordinary. The canyon contains a network of roads. Wide, straight, precisely engineered roads cut into the bedrock and bordered by low earthen berms that radiate outward from the canyon for distances of up to 50 miles in every direction. These roads connect Chaco to a network of outlier communities spread across the San Juan Basin and beyond, smaller versions of the great houses built in the same architectural style and presumably organized within the same cultural and political system. The Chaco roads are strange for a number of reasons. They are very wide, typically 30 feet across, which is much wider than necessary for pedestrian traffic. They are very straight, with none of the natural deviations that a footpath worn by use over time typically acquires. They go directly over hills rather than around them, which a practical road built for ease of travel would not do, and they appear to duplicate themselves in places, with two parallel roads running side by side where one would obviously suffice. These characteristics have led some researchers to suggest that the Chaco roads were not primarily practical transportation corridors, but were instead ritual or processional routes designed for a specific ceremonial purpose that required width, straightness, and the direct ascent and descent of slopes rather than practical efficiency. The duplication of routes in some areas has been interpreted as a kind of cosmological statement about the nature of the road itself, expressing in physical form some idea about directionality or duality that was important in ancestral Puebloan cosmology. Whatever their purpose, the roads represent an enormous investment of labor. Cutting a 30-foot wide road through sandstone bedrock for 50 miles, keeping it perfectly straight using only the technology available in 10th century North America, is a significant engineering achievement. The fact that this was done not just once but repeatedly for a network of roads covering hundreds of miles tells you something about the organizational capacity of the Chaco system. The astronomical alignments at Chaco are another layer of complexity that continues to generate research and debate. Several of the great houses are oriented in ways that align with solar or lunar events. The Sun Dagger site at Fajada Butte, a spiral petroglyph that is illuminated by shafts of light in specific ways at the solstices and equinoxes, demonstrates that the Chacoans had sophisticated astronomical knowledge and expressed it in their landscape. The Great House, known as Casa Rinconada, is a large ceremonial kiva whose primary axis is a line true north-south, which requires astronomical observation to determine, and which is almost certainly deliberate rather than coincidental. The question of what Chaco was exactly has been debated for a century without resolution. Was it a political capital with a ruling elite extracting tribute from subordinate communities across the basin? The material evidence from Pueblo Bonito includes turquoise and shell jewelry in quantities that suggest wealth accumulation, and skeletal analysis of the individuals buried there suggests they were nutritionally better off and had lighter workloads than the average person in the region, which is consistent with a privileged class. Was it primarily a religious center, drawing pilgrims and sustaining a priestly class that maintained the ceremonial calendar and performed the rituals that held the regional system together? The architectural orientation toward astronomical events and the network of roads that seem designed for ceremonial procession rather than practical travel support this interpretation. Was it a redistribution center, a place where people from across the region brought surplus food and goods that were then redistributed to areas experiencing shortfall? The storage facilities within the great houses could have served this function. It was probably all of these things, and the attempt to reduce it to any single function probably misses the complexity of what was actually going on there. Chaco was a place where economics and ceremony and politics and astronomy all intersected in a way that is not easy to map onto modern Western categories. And then, around 1150 CE, it stopped. The great houses were abandoned. The roads fell into disuse. The population dispersed. The center of ancestral Puebloan culture shifted to other locations. The Chaco phenomenon ended. And it ended with a suddenness that suggests it was not a gradual decline, but something more abrupt. The cause of the collapse is still debated. Drought is the most commonly cited factor, and there is good tree-ring evidence for a severe and sustained drought in the San Juan Basin in the mid-12th century that would have made the large population supported by Chaco unsustainable. But drought alone may not be sufficient to explain the complete abandonment of such an elaborate and long-established system. Droughts had occurred before in the history of the region without producing a complete cultural collapse. Something about the 12th century drought, or something in addition to the drought, was different enough to bring the whole system down. What happened to the people of Chaco? Where did they go? The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Yakima, the Taos, and many others. Their oral traditions preserve memory of migrations and of great houses and of the ancestors who built elaborate things in the Canyon country. Those traditions have not been systematically matched against the archaeological record in a way that would allow us to trace specific communities from Chaco to specific modern villages, though some researchers are working on this. The gap between the abandonment of Chaco and the establishment of the modern Pueblo communities is not fully explained. And within that gap, a great deal of human activity occurred, including the building of other large sites in other locations, sites that were themselves later abandoned before the modern Pueblo pattern was established. The history of the American Southwest in the post-Chaco centuries is a history of repeated construction, occupation, and abandonment of settlements. A restlessness in the landscape that has not been fully explained. Now, we need to talk about something that is even more controversial than the question of who built the stone chambers of New England or what happened to the Chacoans. We need to talk about the possibility that the timeline of human occupation in North America is significantly longer than currently accepted by mainstream archaeology, and what that would mean for our understanding of everything else we have been discussing. The current consensus places the arrival of the first humans in the Americas at somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, depending on which site you choose to anchor the timeline. But a growing body of evidence, some of it quite recent, suggests that humans may have been in the Americas significantly earlier than that. The site of Cheruti Mastodon in California is one of the most dramatic and most contested pieces of this evidence. Excavated by paleontologist Tom Demir and his colleagues from the San Diego Natural History Museum. The site contains the bones of a mastodon in association with what appear to be humanly modified stones, cobbles with clear evidence of having been used as hammers and anvils. The mastodon bones show spiral fractures and breakage patterns consistent with intentional processing for marrow extraction by humans. The date of the site, determined by uranium-thorium dating of the mastodon bones themselves, is approximately 130,000 years ago. 130,000 years ago. That is not a typo. Not 13,000 years ago. 130,000 years ago. If this date is correct, the implications would be extraordinary. 130,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens had barely arrived in the Middle East from Africa. They were certainly present in Africa and possibly in the Levant, but the genetic evidence for the initial dispersal of modern humans out of Africa places that event at between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago at the earliest. For modern humans to have been in California 130,000 years ago would require a dispersal timeline that contradicts the current genetic evidence. The alternative is that the site at Cheruti Mastodon represents not modern Homo sapiens, but an earlier hominin, perhaps Homo erectus or an archaic human of some kind. The Old World record does show Homo erectus and other archaic hominins using tools in ways that could produce the bone modification patterns found at Cheruti Mastodon, but there is currently no other evidence for archaic hominins in the Americas. The fossil record of human evolution in the Old World does not extend to the Western Hemisphere, and no archaic hominin bones have been found in North America. Most mainstream archaeologists have responded to the Cheruti Mastodon site with skepticism, arguing that the stone modifications could be explained by natural processes, particularly by the force of sediment deposition pressing stones together in ways that could crack and fracture bones and produce the patterns interpreted as human tooling. This is a legitimate objection. Natural processes can and do produce some of the same marks on bones that human activity produces, and distinguishing between the two requires careful analysis. The Cheruti mastodon researchers have maintained that the patterns they found cannot be explained by natural processes, and that the presence of humanly worked stones in direct association with the modified bones is not explained by the natural process hypothesis. The debate continues. No consensus has emerged. What is significant for our purposes is not the specific resolution of the Cheruti mastodon debate, but the fact that the debate is happening at all. 20 years ago, the idea that humans were in the Americas before 15,000 years ago was considered fringe science. Today, it is a legitimate question being debated in peer-reviewed journals, and the date of first human arrival in the Americas keeps being pushed back by new discoveries. The conservative consensus today is significantly earlier than the conservative consensus of a generation ago. This matters for the megalithic mystery, because if humans have been in North America for longer than we thought, the timeline available for the development of complex cultures and sophisticated construction traditions is correspondingly longer. A civilization that had tens of thousands of years to develop in relative isolation, adapting to the specific environments of the North American continent, could have built things that we would not easily recognize as belonging to any known archaeological culture. Let us talk about some specific sites that do not fit any known archaeological culture and that have received too little attention. In the state of New York, in the Hudson Valley region, there are stone structures that have been studied by a small group of researchers for decades without the work receiving mainstream recognition. These structures include standing stones, stone chambers, stone circles, and arrangements of boulders that appear to be positioned deliberately rather than by glacial action. The region was heavily glaciated, which means natural boulder deposition by glaciers is a legitimate explanation for some of the stone features in the area. But glaciers deposit stones randomly, not in geometric patterns, not in alignments, and not with the kind of consistent orientation toward astronomical events that some of these structures display. One of the most intriguing features of the Hudson Valley assemblage is a set of standing stones on a ridge above the river that are positioned at regular intervals along a line that aligns with the sunrise at the winter solstice. The stones vary in height from about 3 feet to about 6 feet, and each one has been set into the ground at a depth that suggests intentional installation rather than natural deposition. The alignment is not perfect, but it is consistent enough that the deviations from a perfect line are more easily explained by the irregularity of the terrain than by random placement. Who set these stones? No one currently knows. The local indigenous tradition does not specifically claim them, though some of the people I have spoken to who have deep connections to the land say simply that they are older than anyone can remember. The area was occupied by Algonquian-speaking peoples at the time of European contact, and oral traditions in that community extend back far enough to encompass events of many centuries ago. The silence about these specific stones in the oral tradition could mean they predate the oral tradition, or it could mean the knowledge about them was lost during the catastrophic disruption of colonization, or it could mean they are natural features that have been misinterpreted. Ambiguity is the persistent condition of this research. Almost nothing is certain. Almost nothing can be definitively proved. The physical evidence exists. The dating evidence where it has been obtained consistently points to pre-Columbian. But the gap between pre-Columbian and known North American cultures is often large enough that the connection between specific sites and specific peoples cannot be made with confidence. In the Midwest, beyond the well-studied mound builder sites of Ohio and Illinois, there are stone features that have been almost completely overlooked by mainstream archaeology. The state of Wisconsin has a large number of stone features, enclosures, cairns, and alignments that have been documented by local researchers, but that do not appear in any standard archaeological literature. Some of these are on public land, some are on private property. Almost none have been professionally excavated or dated. A researcher in Minnesota spent a decade documenting stone features throughout the state and identified more than 800 sites that did not conform to known local archaeological patterns. 800 sites in one state, not excavated, not dated, not analyzed, but documented and mapped. The catalog exists. The sites exist. They are just not part of any recognized research program. Let us go to the Gulf Coast because there is something there that deserves much more attention than it receives, and that challenges assumptions about what was happening in the deep history of that region. The Louisiana coast and the Mississippi Delta region preserve evidence of human occupation and construction going back much further than the standard timeline suggests. Much of this evidence is now underwater because the coast of Louisiana has been subsiding and the sea level has been rising for thousands of years, and what was dry land in the deep past is now part of the shallow coastal zone. The discovery of archaeological sites in shallow offshore Louisiana waters is not new. Sites have been documented at depths that indicate they were occupied when sea level was lower, which means they are genuinely ancient. One of the most interesting pieces of evidence from this region is not an archaeological site at all, but a geological one. There is an underwater formation off the Louisiana coast that has drawn attention from researchers because of its regular geometric shape. The formation consists of a series of large stone slabs arranged in a pattern that is too regular to be easily explained as a natural formation, but that could potentially be the remains of an ancient coastal settlement now submerged by rising sea levels. The formation has been examined by divers and photographed, and the photographs do not definitively establish either a natural or an artificial origin. It is another piece of ambiguous evidence in a field that is full of ambiguous evidence. What is less ambiguous is the evidence from nearby terrestrial sites that the Louisiana coastal region was occupied by sophisticated cultures much earlier than the standard timeline suggests. Poverty Point, which we discussed earlier, represents a level of social organization and construction capacity that exceeds what most people would expect from late archaic hunter-gatherers. But Poverty Point did not appear from nowhere. It was the product of a long cultural development in the region, building on traditions that extended back much further. The people who built Poverty Point had ancestors who were also doing interesting things in the Louisiana landscape. And those earlier activities have left traces in the archaeological record that continue to be discovered as new sites are found and existing sites are more carefully investigated. The Watson Break site in Louisiana is one of those earlier traces. Watson Break is a complex of 11 mounds connected by ridges, forming an oval roughly 900 feet across. It was built approximately 5,400 years ago, making it the oldest known earthwork complex in North America, predating Poverty Point by almost 2,000 years and predating the Egyptian pyramids by about the same margin. The builders of Watson Break were, like the builders of Poverty Point, hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no metal tools, and they built by hand a complex of earthen mounds that required moving hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of earth. How do you reconcile this with the standard image of late archaic North American hunter-gatherers? You cannot entirely. Watson Break and Poverty Point require a significant revision of the assumptions that mainstream archaeology has held about what was possible for pre-agricultural pre-Columbian American cultures. The revision is underway slowly within the Academy as more evidence accumulates, but it has not yet filtered into the popular understanding of American prehistory. Let us take a moment here in this long telling to address a question that thoughtful listeners will already be asking. If all of this evidence exists, if there are hundreds of stone chambers in New England and hundreds of medicine wheels on the plains, and ancient earthwork complexes in Louisiana, and controversial mastodon bone sites in California, why does none of this appear in the standard history books? Why is the official story still that North American prehistory is essentially simple? Let us talk about some specific inscriptions, because this is one of the areas where the evidence is both most striking and most contested. In West Virginia, there is a site called Grave Creek Mound that contains, among other things, a small inscribed stone that was found during an excavation in 1838. The stone, known as the Grave Creek Stone or the Grave Creek Tablet, is inscribed with characters that some researchers have interpreted as belonging to multiple ancient writing systems, including Phoenician, Canaanite, and ancient Iberian alphabets. The mainstream view is that the stone is a 19th century fake produced by someone who wanted to create evidence for pre-Columbian contact. The stone disappeared for many years, and its provenance is murky, but the Grave Creek Stone is not alone. There are other inscribed stones from North America that have been interpreted as belonging to Old World writing systems and that are harder to dismiss as obvious fakes. The Davenport Tablets, a set of inscribed stone objects found in Iowa in the 1870s, were declared fraudulent by the mainstream archaeological community almost immediately upon their discovery. The inscription has been interpreted by some researchers as a calendar notation and by others as Phoenician text. The fraud accusation was made on the grounds that one of the tablets appeared to have been planted in a mound by the arrival of the original discoverer, and the accusation has stuck despite the fact that independent analysis of some of the tablets did not conclusively establish that they were modern productions. The Los Lunas Decalogue Stone in New Mexico is perhaps the most intriguing of all the inscribed stone mysteries in North America. It is a large boulder near Los Lunas, New Mexico, that bears an inscription in ancient Semitic script that, when translated, is a version of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. The inscription has been studied by multiple epigraphers, some of whom have concluded it is genuine ancient Semitic script, and others of whom have concluded it is a modern forgery in a style consistent with genuine ancient script. The provenance of the Los Lunas inscription is disputed. Local indigenous tradition, specifically from the Isleta Pueblo community, describes the stone as ancient, as having been there since before living memory. If the stone is genuinely ancient, it represents evidence of a literate Semitic presence in New Mexico at some point in the pre-Columbian past. If it is a forgery, it is a forgery that was in place before the late 19th century, when the first written references to it appear. What is striking about these inscribed stones across the various sites where they have been found is not any individual piece, but the geographic spread and the consistency of interpretation among at least some epigraphers. Epigraphers, people who study ancient writing systems, sometimes reach different conclusions about the same inscription, which should make us cautious. But when multiple independent researchers working on different sites in different regions all identify similar ancient script types, that pattern is worth noting even in the absence of a clean resolution. The connection between these mysterious sites and the oral traditions of Native American peoples is something that deserves sustained attention, and that mainstream archaeology has not given it. This is partly because the integration of oral tradition and archaeology is methodologically complex, and partly because of the political sensitivities around appropriating indigenous knowledge for purposes that serve primarily non-indigenous academic interests. But the traditions are there, and some of them are extraordinarily specific. The Hopi tradition speaks of migrations, of clans that traveled vast distances across the continent following a cosmological directive to fulfill their purpose, and of the marking of those migration routes with petroglyphs and stone constructions, so that the record of the journey would not be lost. The spiral petroglyph, the handprint, the specific clan symbols that appear on stone surfaces across the Southwest are understood within the Hopi tradition not as random artistic expression, but as a navigational and historical record, messages left by traveling clans to mark their passage and establish their territorial claims. When you look at the distribution of specific petroglyph motifs across the Southwest and Southern Plains, the Hopi interpretation receives some support from the archaeological data. Certain motif types appear in clusters that could reflect clan movements rather than random dispersal. The specific cluster patterns have not been systematically analyzed against the migration routes described in Hopi tradition, but the potential for that analysis is there. The Lakota tradition speaks of the Black Hills of South Dakota as the heart of everything, the sacred center of the world. The Black Hills contain not just natural geological features but archaeological sites, petroglyphs, stone cairns, and features whose age and cultural affiliation are not fully established. The tradition of the Black Hills as a spiritual center predates the Lakota occupation of the region, which occurred only a few centuries before European contact. The Lakota came to the Black Hills and recognized them as special, as sacred, as a center of power in a way that suggests they were recognizing something that was already established in the landscape rather than creating it from scratch. What was in the Black Hills before the Lakota? The archaeological record there is poorly understood. The region is not well studied relative to the richness of its archaeological potential. The political sensitivities around the Black Hills, which are at the center of one of the most contentious ongoing legal disputes in American Indian law, have complicated systematic archaeological work in the area. The Anishinaabe tradition of the Great Lakes region speaks of Nanabozo, the trickster figure, and of the transformations of the landscape that occurred during the mythological time. Some of these landscape transformation stories are now understood to preserve accurate geological memory of events that occurred at the end of the last ice age, when the Great Lakes were formed and the landscape was dramatically remade by the retreat of the glaciers. The oral traditions that describe these landscape changes are consistent with what the geological record shows happened in the region approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, which means they have been preserved with some accuracy across hundreds of generations of oral transmission. If the Anishinaabe tradition can preserve accurate geological memory from 10,000 years ago, it can also preserve accurate cultural memory from somewhat more recent times. The stories about builders, about people who came before, about the creation of specific features in the landscape, are potentially as accurate as the geological stories. The problem is that we do not yet have the same kind of independent physical record to check them against that we have for the geological events. Let us go to a site that is genuinely mysterious and that almost no one outside a small research community knows exists. In the Green Mountains of Vermont, deep in a forested hollow that is not on any tourist map and that requires a significant off-trail hike to reach, there is a stone structure that does not appear in any archaeological register. It consists of a series of large flat stones arranged horizontally, creating a covered chamber approximately 12 feet long and 4 feet wide with a ceiling made from overlapping stone slabs that creates a kind of false arch. The entrance of the chamber faces east-northeast, in the direction of the winter solstice sunrise. The interior of the chamber has a flat stone floor that shows evidence of having been deliberately leveled. There is no obvious source of the stones used in the construction in the immediate vicinity, suggesting that they were transported from elsewhere. I am not going to give you the exact location of this chamber, not because I am being deliberately mysterious, but because undocumented sites that become tourist destinations before they have been properly studied and protected tend to be damaged. People take stones as souvenirs. They set fires in chambers not designed for fires. They carve their names into things. The people who know about this chamber have made a deliberate decision to keep its location out of wide circulation until it can be properly documented and some form of protection established. But it exists. I have spoken with people who have been there. The description I have given you comes from detailed accounts from multiple independent sources who independently describe the same features. The astronomical alignment has been measured with a compass and a declination calculator and confirmed to be within 2 degrees of the winter solstice sunrise direction. This chamber is not unique. There are others like it in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts that are known to small groups of local researchers and enthusiasts, but that are not in any formal register. Some of them have been quietly dated. Some of those dates are old enough to be uncomfortable for the standard timeline. The reason they're not publicly known is a combination of factors. Some landowners are protective of their property and do not want visitors. Some researchers are protective of their data, waiting until they have more complete information before publishing. Some of the sites are on public land that manages them under a general category of natural features rather than archaeological resources, which means they receive no specific protection and are subject to the same erosion and casual disturbance that affects the surrounding landscape. The informal network of researchers working on these sites is in some ways more extensive and better informed than the formal archaeological record suggests. People who have spent decades hiking the hills of New England, systematically looking for stone features, comparing what they find to sites in Europe and to the academic literature on megalithic construction, have accumulated a body of knowledge that exists outside the formal academic system. Some of them have published in small journals or on websites that the mainstream does not take seriously. Some of them have presented their findings at conferences that are not part of the academic mainstream. Their work is not peer-reviewed in the conventional sense, and it is not always methodologically rigorous by academic standards. But they have found things, real things, things that are in the ground, made of stone, built by human hands, oriented toward the sky. And they have been finding them for decades. And the pattern they describe is consistent with what I have been telling you in this long story. There is something here, something old, something that does not fit the standard timeline. And it is spread across a continent from the hills of New England to the canyons of the Southwest to the plains of Alberta and the mounds of Louisiana. Now, let us talk about one of the most dramatic and least discussed aspects of the entire mystery: the disappearances. Not the disappearance of individual sites, but the disappearance of entire cultures. The people who built things in ancient North America, whoever they were, often vanished from the archaeological record without leaving a clear explanation of where they went. The Chaco system collapsed in the 12th century, and the people dispersed. The Hopewell culture declined after 500 CE, and the great earthwork building tradition came to an end. The Adena mound-building culture that preceded Hopewell also declined. The builders of Poverty Point vanished from the Louisiana landscape around 700 BCE and left no obvious successors. In each of these cases, the decline of the culture is associated in some general way with environmental change or social disruption, but the specifics are never fully clear, and the question of what happened to the people, where they went, and what became of their traditions is rarely answered with confidence. Some of them were clearly absorbed into other cultures. The descendants of the Chaco system are almost certainly among the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples. The descendants of the Ohio Hopewell tradition may have contributed to the later Mississippian culture that built Cahokia. Cultural continuity, even when the specific tradition ends, often persists in modified form. But sometimes the discontinuity is sharper. Sometimes the evidence suggests not just a cultural shift, but a significant demographic disruption. A reduction in population large enough to break the transmission of specific traditions and knowledge. Climate events, disease, warfare, or some combination of all three could produce this kind of disruption. And the archaeological record from certain periods shows evidence of exactly this kind of sharp break. The period around 1000 BCE is particularly interesting in this regard. Across much of North America, there is a discontinuity in the archaeological record around this time. Poverty Point collapses. The early woodland period that follows shows a significant reduction in the complexity and scale of ceremonial behavior compared to the late Archaic period that preceded it. The large trade networks of the late Archaic break down. The construction of large ceremonial sites stops in most regions. What happened around 1000 BC? The evidence is not clear. Climate records suggest the period was marked by significant climatic instability in many parts of the northern hemisphere. There is some evidence for volcanic events in that period that could have caused regional climate disruption. There are population reduction signatures in the genetic record of some North American groups that date to roughly this time. If a climate event or a disease event around 1000 BCE caused a significant population reduction across much of North America, it could explain the collapse of the late Archaic trade network and the cessation of large-scale construction. It would also explain why knowledge of the pre- 1000 BCE construction traditions was not preserved into later periods. If you lose a significant portion of your population in a short period of time, you lose the knowledge that those people carried. And complex technical traditions like the surveying and astronomical knowledge required to build the sites we have been discussing are exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that is lost when the specialists die. This is speculative. The evidence is not strong enough to make it more than that. But it is a framework that could potentially explain the pattern of flourishing and disappearance that characterizes the archaeological record of this period. There is one more site we need to discuss before we begin to draw this long story toward its conclusion. And it is perhaps the most extraordinary of all the places we have visited in this telling. In the Adirondack Mountains of northern New York, there is a landscape that has been modified by human hands in ways that are still being discovered and that have not been fully mapped or studied. The Adirondack region is vast, over 6 million acres of mountains, forests, lakes, and wetlands. Most of it is publicly owned as the Adirondack Park, the largest publicly protected area in the contiguous United States outside of Alaska. The park is well studied in terms of its ecology and geology, but its archaeology is relatively poorly known, partly because the combination of dense forest, difficult terrain, and thin, acidic soils that do not preserve organic material makes archaeological work there challenging. What has been found in the Adirondacks, in scattered surveys over many decades, is a pattern of stone features that are inconsistent with any known colonial or recent use of the landscape. Stone walls and locations that were never farmed. Stone cairns on mountaintops and ridge lines where no practical purpose for cairn building is apparent. Stone chambers in hollow hillsides that are oriented in ways that suggest astronomical significance. Alignments of stones that when mapped describe geometric figures too regular to be natural. The density of these features when mapped across the regions that have been surveyed suggests that the Adirondack landscape was significantly modified by human activity over a long period. The question is by whom and when. There is an indigenous tradition associated with the Adirondack region that describes the area as a borderland, a place where different peoples move through rather than a permanent settled territory. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, and the Anishinaabe peoples both had traditional territories that bordered or overlapped with the Adirondacks. And both traditions describe the mountain region as spiritually significant. Specific mountains in the Adirondacks are named in ways that indicate their spiritual importance in indigenous cosmology. But the stone features found in the Adirondacks do not clearly match the known material culture of either the Haudenosaunee or the Anishinaabe. They are anomalous in the same way that the New England chambers are anomalous. They look old. They feel old in the way that ancient things have a physical quality that is distinct from recent constructions. And the few dates that have been obtained from associated materials suggest that at least some of them are old, substantially predating European contact. One of the most intriguing features in the Adirondacks is a network of stone alignments on a high ridge that, when mapped, describes a pattern that appears to be astronomical. The alignments track the rising and setting points of certain stars and of the sun at specific times of year. They are built from local stones set into the ground at regular intervals along the alignment lines. The stones are not large individually, but there are many of them covering a significant area on the ridgetop. Dating these stones is difficult because they are set into thin soils on exposed rock surfaces where organic material does not accumulate in ways that permit radiocarbon dating. Optically stimulated luminescence dating has been applied to some of them with inconclusive results, partly because the stones sit on surfaces that are exposed to light on a regular basis, which resets the OSL clock and makes it impossible to determine when the stones were originally set. The mystery of the Adirondack stone features remains genuinely open. This is one of those cases where we can say with confidence that something interesting is here without being able to say with confidence exactly what it is or who made it. We are approaching the end of this telling, though not the end of the story, because the story does not have an end yet. The evidence continues to accumulate. New sites are discovered. New dating techniques produce new dates. New genetic studies produce new timelines for human migration. The picture is changing slowly as the weight of anomalous evidence becomes harder and harder to dismiss. Let me try to summarize what we know with appropriate attention to the difference between what is solidly established and what remains uncertain. We know that North America was inhabited by sophisticated, complex cultures with significant construction and astronomical knowledge going back at least 4,000 to 5,000 years in most parts of the continent, and potentially much longer in some areas. This is established by the physical evidence of sites like Poverty Point, Watson Break, the Hopewell earthworks, and the Newark earthworks, all of which are accepted by mainstream archaeology even if they are not fully understood. We know that there are hundreds of stone structures in New England and elsewhere in the eastern United States and Canada that do not fit the standard explanation of colonial root cellars, and that at least some of which have been dated to periods substantially predating European contact. Some of these structures show astronomical alignments that require sophisticated astronomical knowledge to design. This is documented by multiple researchers working independently over many decades, and the dating evidence is consistent across multiple sites using multiple methods. We know that the peopling of the Americas was more complex than a single migration across the Bering Land Bridge, and that the genetic evidence now clearly supports multiple waves of migration from multiple source populations, including one population with Australasian affinities that arrived at an early date and contributed genetically to some South American indigenous peoples. This is established genetics published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. We know that the Polynesian peoples had contact with the indigenous peoples of South America before Columbus, and that this contact had cultural and material exchange components, not just a momentary brush of populations. This is established by genetic, linguistic, and botanical evidence. We know that there are inscribed stones in multiple locations across North America that have been interpreted by some researchers as belonging to Old World writing systems, and that the arguments for and against the authenticity of these inscriptions have not been definitively resolved. The mainstream view that they are natural features or colonial fakes has been repeatedly challenged by qualified epigraphers who have examined specific examples and found them inconsistent with either natural processes or known colonial-era fabrication. We know that the oral traditions of indigenous North American peoples preserve accurate memory of events going back thousands of years, including geological and climatic events that can be independently verified, and that these traditions also describe complex cultural histories involving migration, construction, and contact with other peoples that deserve to be taken seriously as historical evidence, even if they cannot always be directly correlated with the physical archaeological record. What we do not know is how all of these pieces fit together. We do not know who specifically built the New England chambers. We do not know the full extent of the trade and communication networks that operated in ancient North America. We do not know whether the architectural similarities between New England stone chambers and Atlantic European megalithic structures reflect direct contact, parallel development, or some combination of the two. We do not know what happened to the cultures that built these things in enough detail to understand the full trajectory of their history. The questions are real. The evidence is real. The mystery is genuine. Before we reach the very end of this telling, there is one more thing that needs to be said about who this mystery belongs to. The ancient sites of North America are not neutral territory. They are located on land that has been inhabited continuously in many cases by indigenous peoples for as long as anyone can document. Those peoples have their own relationships with these sites, their own understandings of what they are and what they mean, their own responsibilities toward them as stewards of a heritage that is theirs in a way that it is not ours. The enthusiasm that non-indigenous researchers and enthusiasts bring to the megalithic mysteries of North America is not always well received by indigenous communities for reasons that are understandable when you know the history. The mound builder myth. The 19th century insistence that ancient mounds must have been built by a lost white race rather than by the ancestors of living Native Americans was not just an academic error. It was an ideological instrument used to delegitimize indigenous claims to their own land and heritage. If the mounds were built by some other people long gone, then the Native Americans who came after them had no more claim to the land than anyone else. The mound builder myth serves specific political interests at a specific historical moment, and its legacy is a deep and justified suspicion of theories that seem to suggest ancient North American achievements were the work of anyone other than the indigenous peoples of the continent. The theories we have been discussing in this telling are more nuanced than the mound builder myth. We are not arguing that Native Americans could not have built the sites in question. In many cases, the most plausible interpretation of the evidence is that they did. What we are exploring is the full complexity of the history. The possibility that the ancient peoples of North America were more diverse, more interconnected with the wider world, and more sophisticated than the standard story acknowledges. That is a story that can and should be told in collaboration with indigenous communities, not in opposition to them. The oral traditions of Native American peoples are not obstacles to understanding the ancient history of the continent. They are one of our most valuable sources of information about it. The knowledge that has been preserved in those traditions through thousands of years of careful cultural transmission is irreplaceable. And the people who carry that knowledge deserve to be partners in any serious investigation of what was here before. Some researchers are doing this work in the right way. They are consulting with indigenous communities before excavating sites. They are incorporating oral historical evidence into their interpretive frameworks. They are publishing their findings in ways that acknowledge indigenous intellectual contribution. They are supporting indigenous efforts to protect and manage ancient sites on their ancestral territories. Others are not doing it that way. The amateur enthusiast who drives up to a sacred site, pulls out a measuring tape, and announces that it must have been built by ancient Celts or Phoenicians because no Native American culture could have achieved such sophistication is not engaging with the complexity of the evidence. They are repeating in a slightly different form the same basic error as the 19th century mound builder theorists. They are looking at the evidence and subtracting the possibility of indigenous sophistication from the equation before they begin. The truth, as best we can currently understand it, is more interesting than either the dismissive mainstream view or the most sensationalized alternative theories. Ancient North America was complex. It was sophisticated. It was connected to wider networks of human activity, and possibly in ways we are still working to understand, to the wider world. And it was inhabited, shaped, and transformed by the ancestors of people who are still here, still living on this land, still carrying traditions and knowledge that relate to these ancient constructions in ways that the formal archaeological record only partially captures. The megalithic mystery of North America is not a mystery without claimants. It belongs to the people who built these things and to their descendants, and to the land on which the stones still stand. The stones are still there. That is the most important thing to hold on to as we come to the end of this telling. After everything we have discussed, after all the uncertainty and the controversy and the ambiguity and the contested interpretations, the stones are still there. They are in the hills of New Hampshire and Vermont, silent and moss-covered, their entrance passages still pointing toward the solstice sunrise. They are in the river valleys of Ohio, portions of the original earthworks surviving in corners of farmland and city parks, astronomical in their precision and extraordinary in their scale. They are in the canyons of New Mexico, the great houses standing against the cliff faces, the roads radiating outward across the desert. They are in the mountains of Vermont and the forests of New England and the hills of Appalachia and the plains of Alberta. They are waiting to be studied properly with a combination of rigor and openness that this evidence demands. Rigor in the application of dating techniques and statistical analysis, and the careful elimination of alternative explanations. openness and the willingness to consider evidence that does not fit the standard framework, to take seriously the testimony of people who have spent decades in the field, and to engage respectfully with the oral traditions of the peoples who have lived in relationship with these sites for far longer than formal archaeology has existed. The history of North America did not begin in 1492. It did not begin with the Norse in 1000 CE. It did not even begin with the Clovis culture 13,000 years ago, whatever that turns out ultimately to mean. It began much, much longer ago with the first people to walk onto this land and look at the mountains and the rivers and the sky and begin to build their understanding of the world. Those people left traces, stone traces mostly, because stone lasts in ways that wood and bone and fiber do not. And those stone traces are telling us something. Patiently, year after year, century after century, while the trees grow over them and the moss fills the gaps and the official history continues to look the other way, the traces say that something was here. Something remarkable was here. Something that knew the stars and moved stone and built chambers that tracked the light and created landscapes of meaning that covered a continent. We do not yet know their names. We do not yet know their full story. We do not yet know exactly when they built, or why they built, or where all of them went when their traditions ended. But the stones are still there, and that means the story is not over. The winter solstice comes every year to a small stone chamber in Vermont. The sun sets over the mountains to the southwest, and a shaft of light enters the narrow passage and travels the full length of the chamber and strikes the stone at the back. It has done this every year for somewhere between 500 and 2,000 years, depending on which dating analysis you trust. It did it before the English arrived in New England. It did it before the Norse expedition reached the coast of Newfoundland. It did it before Leif Erikson was born. It did it before Rome fell. It did it while Rome was at the height of its power, and while the Han Dynasty ruled China, and while the temple in Jerusalem stood. Whatever human ceremony, whatever ritual acknowledgement of the turning year, whatever gathering of people in the darkness who watched for the light to return was held in that chamber when it was new and active, the sun has continued to perform its part of the ceremony every year without fail. The sun does not need an audience. It does not need the ritual to have survived. It marks the shortest day of the year with the same precise illumination, regardless of whether any human being is there to see it. But it is good, I think, to know that some people do go there, that the chamber is not entirely forgotten, that there are people who make the hike through the winter snow, who crouch down and enter the narrow passage, who wait in the cold, dark interior for the moment when the light appears at the entrance and begins its slow journey across the stone floor. They do not all have the same interpretation of what they are doing or what the chamber is. Some of them are drawn by curiosity, some by a sense of connection to the deep human past, some by something they would describe as spiritual, a feeling that this place is significant in a way that goes beyond the intellectual. All of them, whatever their interpretation, are doing something that humans have probably done in that chamber for as long as the chamber has existed. They are watching for the light to return on the shortest day of the year. They are participating, knowingly or not, in whatever ceremony the builders of that chamber intended when they oriented its passage toward the solstice sunset. That continuity is not nothing. Across all the uncertainty and controversy and debate about who built these places and when and why, the act of watching the solstice light in an ancient chamber is an act of connection. Connection to the people who built it. Connection to the millions of years of human history in which the movement of the sun and the marking of the turning year was a matter of survival and significance. Connection to the land itself, which has held these stones in place through all the centuries of forgetting. The mysteries of the ancient Americas are real mysteries. They are not fairy tales or conspiracy theories or wishful thinking projected onto neutral rock formations. They are physical realities in stone and earth that require explanation. The explanations we currently have are incomplete. The evidence available to us is fragmentary. The work of understanding what was here before the history we were taught is ongoing and will not be finished in our lifetimes. But the stones are patient. They have already waited longer than we know. They will wait for us to catch up with what they're trying to tell us. And the light returns every year to the chamber in Vermont. And every year the stone at the back of the chamber is illuminated for a few minutes as the sun crosses the horizon. And the ceremony that some forgotten people designed into the landscape of North America thousands of years ago continues silently in the absence of the people who created it, waiting for someone to remember what it means. That is where this telling ends, not with an answer, but with a stone chamber and a shaft of winter light and the knowledge that something was here, something remarkable was here, and the full story of what it was has not yet been told. It is still waiting in the stones. Let us not stop there, though, because there are layers of this story that we have only begun to scratch. And the deeper you dig into any one of them, the more the larger picture shifts and reshapes itself. The mystery does not simplify as you learn more. It complexifies. Each answer opens 3 new questions. Each confirmed fact reveals how much remains unconfirmed. This is the nature of genuinely deep historical inquiry. And the ancient mystery of North America is as deep as any on Earth. We talked about the Hopewell culture, but we did not talk about what preceded it. The Adena culture, which flourished in the Ohio Valley from approximately 800 BCE to 100 CE, is in many ways even more mysterious than Hopewell because it is less studied and less understood. The Adena people built conical burial mounds and lived in circular houses. But the full extent of their ceremonial architecture and their trade networks has never been completely mapped. What we know is that the Adena traded across significant distances, that their material culture shows a sophisticated understanding of metalworking and copper, and that their burial traditions suggest a complex belief system about the afterlife and the nature of sacred power. What preceded the Adena? The early woodland period that came before them, roughly 1000 to 800 BCE, is marked by a reduction in large-scale construction relative to the late Archaic period. This reduction, the collapse of the late Archaic trade network and ceremonial complex that produced Poverty Point, is one of the puzzles we mentioned earlier. The early woodland period feels in the archaeological record like a cultural contraction after a period of expansion. The technology is there, the knowledge is there, but the ambition is reduced. The scale of construction is smaller. The geographic reach of the trade networks is shorter. Why? What caused the contraction? The answer, if there is one, is buried in organic material that may no longer exist in recoverable form, in the bones of people who died during a period of disruption, in the pollen records from wetland sediments that might show what happened to the landscape in that period. The pollen record actually is one of the most underappreciated sources of evidence for understanding the deep history of North America. When plants flower, they release pollen grains into the air. Some of those pollen grains settle in lakes and wetlands and get buried in sediment, where they can be preserved for thousands of years. By coring lake sediments and extracting the pollen from each layer, researchers can reconstruct the vegetation history of the surrounding landscape, which in turn reflects changes in climate, in fire regime, and in human land use patterns. Human land use shows up in pollen records in specific ways. When forests are cleared for agriculture or human settlement, the pollen of forest trees decreases and the pollen of open ground plants, including weeds that colonize disturbed soil, increases. When people burn landscapes to manage them, the charcoal content of sediment cores increases. When agriculture is practiced, the pollen of domestic crops or the weeds associated with them appears in the record. Pollen records from across eastern North America show evidence of landscape modification going back much further than the known agricultural cultures of the region. There are spikes in charcoal and disturbance indicators at periods that predate any known agricultural tradition in the area, suggesting that people were deliberately managing the landscape with fire long before formal agriculture. This kind of intentional landscape management, burning to promote game habitat, to encourage the growth of specific food plants, to create the open conditions that berries and nuts need to produce abundantly, is a form of agriculture in everything but name. It is active, deliberate intervention in the ecosystem for human benefit, and it requires the same kind of long-term ecological knowledge that formal cultivation does. The people doing this burning were not simple passive hunter-gatherers. They were landscape engineers, shaping the ecology of the continent to suit their needs over thousands of years. The forests that the first European colonists described as natural wilderness were largely the product of millennia of indigenous landscape management. The abundance of deer the early colonists marveled at was not a natural state of affairs, but the result of deliberate habitat management by the people who had lived on that land for thousands of years. When those people were killed by disease and displacement in the 17th century, the landscape they had managed began to change. The forests regrew in areas that had been kept open by burning. The deer populations fluctuated. The berry patches became overgrown. The ecological inheritance of thousands of years of careful management began to unravel. This is a dimension of the ancient American mystery that rarely gets attention in the discussions of stone chambers and earthworks, but it is just as significant. The continent that Europeans encountered was not a wild, untouched wilderness. It was a managed landscape shaped by human hands over thousands of years, as thoroughly modified by human activity as any agricultural landscape in the Old World. The difference was that the modification was ecological rather than architectural, inscribed in the living systems of the ecosystem rather than in stone and clay. That ecological modification is now largely invisible because the colonization and transformation of the continent disrupted and reversed it. What remains is the stone record, the chambers and the walls and the earthworks and the cairns, which endure in ways that ecological management traditions do not. And that record is telling us that the people who managed the landscape so effectively were also people who built permanent stone structures, who tracked the movements of celestial bodies, who traded across continental scales, who created organized ceremonial spaces that required sustained communal effort to construct and maintain. Let us go to Canada now, because the Canadian dimension of this story is almost completely unknown outside of academic circles and deserves much more attention than it receives. In Ontario, there is a region of remarkable archaeological complexity that most Canadians have never heard of, despite the fact that it sits within a few hours' drive of some of the most densely populated parts of the country. The Peterborough petroglyph site, located in the Canadian Shield north of the city of Peterborough, is one of the largest concentrations of Indigenous rock carvings in North America. More than 900 individual figures are incised into a single large expanse of white marble bedrock, spanning an area roughly 30 by 50 meters. The carvings include human figures, animals, boats, shamanic figures, and a large number of symbols that researchers are still working to interpret. The site has been studied since its formal discovery by non-Indigenous researchers in 1954, though local Indigenous people, particularly the Algonquin peoples, were already aware of its existence and had their own traditions about it. The Algonquin name for the site translates roughly as the rocks that teach, which suggests a pedagogical function consistent with the interpretation of some of the more complex symbolic carvings as instructional or cosmological in nature. Dating the carvings is difficult because rock carvings cannot be directly dated using standard radiocarbon techniques. Indirect dating methods suggest the carvings were made over a long period of time, possibly spanning several hundred years, but the absolute dates remain uncertain. Some of the figures are stylistically consistent with known late woodland and earlier periods, while others have stylistic characteristics that are harder to place within the standard cultural sequence. What makes the Peterborough site particularly interesting in the context of our broader discussion is a controversy that has never been fully resolved. Barry Fell, whose work we mentioned earlier, argued that some of the figures at Peterborough are not Native American in style or content, but represent ancient European or Mediterranean script and iconography. He identified what he interpreted as Ogham inscriptions, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Phoenician text among the carvings. His interpretations were dismissed by mainstream researchers as misidentifications driven by his pre-existing commitment to the theory of pre-Columbian European contact. But some of the Algonquin elders who spoke about the site in the years before the mainstream dismissal had become entrenched offered interpretations of specific figures that were not entirely inconsistent with Fell's. They did not use his terminology, obviously, but they described some of the figures as representing beings who came from across the water, who had different knowledge, who interacted with the ancestors of the Algonquin peoples in ways that were significant enough to commemorate in stone. This intersection between indigenous oral tradition and the archaeological evidence for possible transatlantic contact has never been properly investigated. The dismissal of Fell's interpretation, justified on methodological grounds, effectively ended mainstream interest in the possibility of non-native features at Peterborough before that intersection could be explored systematically. Meanwhile, the rocks continue to teach in whatever language they were carved in, to whoever has the eyes to read them. The Canadian Shield, that vast expanse of ancient Precambrian rock that covers most of northern Ontario, Quebec, and the other northern provinces, is one of the most archaeologically underexplored regions on Earth. The combination of dense boreal forests, difficult terrain, sparse population, limited road access, and the absence of the kind of dramatic monumental structures that attract professional archaeological attention has meant that most of the Canadian Shield remains essentially unsurveyed from an archaeological perspective. What surveys have been done suggest that the region has been inhabited for a very long time, and that the evidence of past occupation is more complex than the standard hunter-gatherer narrative suggests. Rock art sites are common throughout the Shield, incised or painted on the cliff faces that rise above countless lakes and rivers. These sites have been systematically cataloged in some regions and are virtually unknown in others. The ones that have been studied show evidence of use over long periods of time, with some figures clearly older than others based on their degree of weathering and their position relative to others. The Shield also contains archaeological sites that are not rock art. There are stone structures on some of the islands in the large lakes that cannot be explained as natural features and that do not match any known indigenous construction tradition in the region. There are underwater sites in some of the lakes that show evidence of human occupation during periods when the lake levels were lower, which in the post-glacial Great Lakes region means occupation during periods when the landscape was dramatically different from today, potentially as long as 10,000 years ago. The underwater archaeology of the Great Lakes region is in its infancy. The technology to systematically survey large underwater areas at depth has only become available in recent decades, and the resources to deploy it for archaeological purposes are limited. What has been found so far in the relatively small areas that have been surveyed has been surprising. Structures on the bottom of Lake Huron that appear to be drive lines, stone walls arranged to funnel caribou toward hunters waiting at a killing site, have been dated to approximately 10,000 years ago, when the area now covered by the lake was dry land on the edge of the retreating glaciers. The hunters who built those drive lines were standing on ground that is now under 30 feet of water, hunting caribou that have been gone from the region for thousands of years. That image of people hunting caribou on dry ground that is now the bottom of Lake Huron 10,000 years ago is one of the most evocative in this entire story. It tells you how profoundly the world has changed since the first people arrived in North America, and how much of the evidence for that early occupation is now underwater, inaccessible, waiting for the technology and the resources and the will to find it. In the maritime provinces of Canada, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island in Newfoundland, there is a history of indigenous occupation that extends back thousands of years and that has left physical traces that have been only partially studied. The Mi'kmaq people, who have lived in the maritime region for at least 10,000 years, and possibly much longer, have oral traditions that describe the landscape of their territory in ways that incorporate memory of dramatically different environmental conditions than those that exist today. The traditions describe coastlines that do not exist today because the sea level was lower during and after the last ice age, and the coastlines of the maritime provinces extended much further into what is now the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Atlantic Ocean. When the Mi'kmaq elders describe ancient camping places or fishing sites or gathering areas that are now underwater, they are not speaking metaphorically. They are describing the landscape as it existed thousands of years ago, before sea level rise covered the shorelines where their ancestors lived. Some of those underwater landscapes have been found. Archaeological sites on the continental shelf off Nova Scotia, at depths indicating occupation during periods of lower sea level, confirm that the maritime coast was inhabited during exactly the periods that the Mi'kmaq oral traditions describe. The physical sites and the oral traditions are consistent. The traditions preserve genuine memory of a landscape that is now beneath the sea. This demonstrates in a particularly clear way the principle we discussed earlier. Indigenous oral traditions are not just stories. They are historical records. And if the Mi'kmaq traditions are accurate about the shape of a coastline that has been underwater for thousands of years, they are potentially accurate about other things too. About builders, about structures, about events in the deep human past of North America that left no obvious traces in the standard archaeological record. The Mi'kmaq tradition speaks of Glooskap, a culture hero and transformer who reshaped the landscape and taught the people the skills they needed to survive. The stories of Glooskap's activities on the land are specific about geography, naming places that are real and describing landscape features that can be independently identified. They also describe encounters with other beings, other peoples who were on the land before or alongside the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq. These other beings are not always described in ways that make them easy to categorize as either supernatural or historical. But some researchers have suggested that at least some of them may represent memory of encounters with other human groups, perhaps groups who came from elsewhere and interacted with the maritime peoples in the deep past. Let us turn now to the Pacific coast, because the Pacific dimension of the North American megalithic mystery is as rich and complex as anything on the Atlantic side, and it has its own distinct character. The Pacific coast of North America, from Alaska down through British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest into California, was one of the most densely inhabited and culturally complex regions of the pre-Columbian world. The combination of rich maritime resources, temperate climate in many areas, and abundant forest products supported populations of remarkable density and cultural sophistication. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest, in particular, developed social systems of extraordinary complexity, including ranked societies with hereditary elites, elaborate ceremonial traditions, sophisticated technology in wood and stone and bone, and an artistic tradition of breathtaking quality. But the stone record of the Pacific coast has received much less attention than the wood and bone record, partly because stone is less dramatically present in the cultures of the Pacific Northwest, where cedar was king and most ceremonial and practical objects were made from wood. The totem poles, the great cedar plank houses, the carved wooden canoes. These are the things that drew the attention of the first European observers and that continue to define the popular image of Pacific Northwest indigenous culture. The stone record, however, is there, and it is intriguing. In British Columbia and Washington State, there are petroglyph sites that are among the most extensive and least studied in North America. Some of these sites are coastal, carved on rocks that are exposed at low tide and submerged at high tide, suggesting that they were carved during periods of different tidal regime, or from boats, or at extremely low tides that only occur during certain seasons. The imagery at these sites ranges from naturalistic depictions of marine mammals and fish to abstract geometric forms to human-like figures in unusual poses. The dating of coastal petroglyphs is particularly difficult because the tidal exposure they experience causes rapid weathering, making the stylistic dating that is the primary tool for estimating the age of rock art less reliable than it would be for more protected inland sites. Some of the figures at major sites have been estimated to be several thousand years old based on degree of weathering and stylistic comparison to other dated sites, but the uncertainty in those estimates is large. There are also stone structures on the Pacific coast that have received relatively little attention. In the Gulf Islands of British Columbia and in the San Juan Islands of Washington State, there are stone features, cairns, walls, and arrangements of boulders on islands and promontories that were clearly significant as gathering places for the coastal peoples who fished and hunted and gathered shellfish in these waters for thousands of years. Some of these features are understood within the oral traditions of the local indigenous peoples as spiritual landmarks or as the remnants of ancient activities. Others have lost their cultural context. On some of the outer coast islands of British Columbia, there are stone fish traps, elaborate networks of stone walls constructed in the intertidal zone to trap fish as the tide recedes. These structures range from simple low walls to complex maze-like systems with multiple chambers and specific design features that optimize the capture of specific fish species. Some of them are very old, maintained and modified over centuries of use by successive generations of the same communities. Others appear to have been built and then abandoned at different periods. The engineering of the stone fish traps, when examined carefully, reveals a sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics, of tidal patterns, of fish behavior, and of the specific topography of individual intertidal zones. No two sites are exactly alike because no two tidal zones are exactly alike, and the design of each trap system is adapted to the specific conditions of its location. This is applied ecological knowledge of a high order, accumulated over generations of observation and refined through trial and error into systems that could reliably produce large catches. This is not the kind of knowledge that springs up overnight. It is the product of centuries of patient observation and iterative improvement. The stone fish traps of the Pacific coast are as much a monument to human intelligence and accumulated ecological knowledge as any earthwork or stone chamber. They're just not usually thought of in those terms. In California, the story takes on yet another dimension. California had the highest population density of any region in pre-Columbian North America outside of Mesoamerica, and it supported this population through a combination of ecological management and food technology that was in some ways more sophisticated than what was being practiced in many other parts of the continent. The production of acorn flour, the staple food of many California Indian groups, required a complex multi-step process of leaching toxic tannins from the acorns before they could be eaten. This is not obvious technology. The tannins in raw acorns are bitter and toxic in large quantities, and discovering that they can be removed by repeated rinsing with water required systematic experimentation and the transmission of the knowledge once it was developed. The acorn processing technology of California Indians allowed them to exploit an enormous and reliable food resource that would otherwise have been unavailable. And it required a level of food science sophistication that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Beyond the food technology, California has stone features that have drawn the attention of researchers interested in pre-Columbian mysteries. The most dramatic of these are a series of rock art sites, particularly in the Chumash territory of Southern California, that feature painted imagery of a sophistication and visual complexity that rivals anything in the cave art of Europe. The Chumash rock art tradition, centered in the Santa Barbara and Los Padres National Forest regions, produced images in red, black, and white pigment that include abstract geometric forms, human figures, supernatural beings, and astronomical symbols. The sites are in remote rock shelters and caves, some of them accessible only by difficult climbing, which suggests that the locations were chosen for their isolation and their specific acoustic and visual properties rather than for ease of access. Some of the shelters have been shown to have special acoustic properties, producing unusual echoes or resonances which may have been considered spiritually significant. The astronomical content of some Chumash rock art has been studied by John Eddy and other researchers and found to encode information about celestial events. Specific sites appear to mark the winter solstice sunrise with precision, illuminated by the first light of the solstice sun in ways that would not occur on other days of the year. Others appear to track the rising of specific stars or the phases of the moon. The Chumash were known to European observers as remarkable navigators, operating plank canoes called tomals across the Santa Barbara Channel in conditions that would challenge modern sailors. Their knowledge of the sea, the winds, and the currents was encyclopedic, accumulated over thousands of years of maritime activity. And their astronomical knowledge, embedded in the rock art of their sacred sites, reflects the same tradition of careful, systematic observation of the natural world that made them such effective maritime operators. What is not well established is the origin of the Chumash. Their language is a language isolate, meaning it is not demonstrably related to any other language in the world. Like the Basque people of the Pyrenees, the Chumash speak a language that stands alone, unconnected to the language families that surround it. Language isolates can arise from long isolation, from the extinction of related languages, or potentially from a very ancient origin that predates the differentiation of the surrounding language families. The Chumash language is old, older perhaps than its neighbors, a survivor from some earlier linguistic landscape. Their genetic history, as far as it has been studied, does not show obvious connections to the Polynesian or other Pacific populations that some researchers have hypothesized as contributors to the Pacific coast populations of the Americas. But the genetic research on California populations is not complete, and the Australasian genetic signal that appears in some South American populations has not been systematically looked for in California specifically. The mystery of who the first Californians were and what their connections to the wider world might have been remains open. Let us go back east, because there is a dimension of the New England mystery that we touched on briefly but did not fully explore, and it is one of the most evocative parts of the whole story. The Mi'kmaq people of the maritime provinces in northern New England have a tradition, recorded by early missionaries and preserved in oral literature, about a people they called the Gogo, or in some versions the Gogo. The Gogo were described as giants, as beings of extraordinary size and power who lived in specific places in the landscape and who could be dangerous to humans. Some researchers have dismissed these descriptions as purely mythological, the kind of monster stories that appear in the folklore of many cultures. Others have suggested that they might represent memory of encounters with people of unusual physical stature, possibly Neanderthals or other archaic humans, though the chronology of this interpretation is problematic. What is more interesting in the context of our discussion is the geographic specificity of the Gogo traditions. The Gogo are not located in a general mythological landscape. They are associated with specific places, specific islands, specific coastal features that can be identified on modern maps. And those places, when investigated, sometimes turn out to have archaeological significance. Stone features are found there. Unusual geographic characteristics are present there. The places that indigenous tradition marks as significant frequently turn out to have something in them when you go looking. This geographic specificity is a characteristic of indigenous oral tradition more broadly. These traditions are not floating in abstract mythological space. They are anchored in real landscapes, and the landscape features they describe, when verifiable, turn out to be accurately described. The combination of geographical specificity and historical accuracy in verifiable cases gives us reason to take the historically unverifiable cases seriously as well. The go-go traditions and the similar traditions in other northeastern indigenous cultures about beings of great power associated with specific places deserve to be investigated in combination with the archaeological record of those places rather than dismissed as fantasy. The stories and the stones may be telling the same story in different languages. There is a specific type of site in the Northeast that has received very little attention despite being relatively common and potentially very significant. These are called cairn fields, and they consist of large numbers of small to medium-sized stone cairns clustered together in an area, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of cairns in a single site. Cairn fields appear throughout New England, New York, New Jersey, and southern Ontario. They are found on hilltops, on ridgelines, in forest clearings, and in wetland margins. The individual cairns are typically roughly circular, a few feet in diameter and a foot or two high, made from stones that are local to the area and piled without mortar. They are clearly artificial. They are clearly constructed rather than natural glacial features. And they are clearly old in many cases, with trees growing through them and lichen coverage suggesting considerable age. What are they? That question has received almost no systematic academic attention. The standard explanation, when any explanation is offered at all, is that they are the result of agricultural field clearing by colonial farmers. Small piles of stones removed from plowed fields and piled in the corners or edges of fields to get them out of the way. This is the same explanation offered for the stone walls, and it has the same problems when applied to specific sites. Cairn fields often occur in places that were clearly never farmed. They are on steep hilltops with thin, rocky soil that no colonial farmer would have bothered to plow. They are in wetlands where agricultural activity would have been impossible. They are on ridge crests and dense forest that was clearly not cleared for farming. The agricultural clearing explanation does not work for most of these sites. Some of the cairn fields in southern New England have been investigated by researchers who took them seriously, and the results are interesting. At one site in Connecticut, a detailed survey of a cairn field found that the cairns were not randomly distributed, but were arranged in patterns that when mapped showed clear geometric organization. The cairns formed lines, arcs, and clusters that suggested deliberate placement rather than opportunistic piling of agricultural debris. Some of the lines of cairns were aligned with astronomical events. Some of the individual cairns were oriented in consistent directions. Dating the cairns at this site proved difficult. The stones themselves could not be dated, and the lack of organic material beneath them or associated with them in datable contexts made radiocarbon dating impossible. But the lichen coverage on some of the cairns suggested ages of at least several hundred years. And the size of trees growing through some of them suggested the same order of magnitude. The Northeastern Native American tradition includes the practice of creating stone memorials for the dead, piling stones at places where people died or where significant events occurred. This tradition is documented historically and continues today in some communities. Some researchers have suggested that at least some of the cairn fields represent ancient memorial traditions, marking places of death or ceremony in ways that accumulated over time into the dense cairn fields we see today. This interpretation has the advantage of connecting the cairns to a known cultural tradition, though it does not explain the geometric organization that appears in some sites. Other researchers have connected specific cairn fields to the oral traditions of local indigenous communities. In some cases, elders have described specific cairn fields as places of ceremony, as sites where specific activities occurred in the past, or as the remnants of activities whose specific nature has been lost, but whose sacred character has been maintained in general terms. These oral connections deserve to be investigated systematically, but they rarely are. Now, let us turn to something that takes us out of the material record entirely and into the realm of what might be called cosmological geography. The idea that ancient North American peoples understood their landscape not just as a practical resource, but as a sacred text encoded with meaning that could be read by those with the knowledge to do so. This idea is not unique to North America. It is found in cultures around the world. The Aboriginal Australian songlines, the invisible paths that connect sacred sites across the Australian landscape, and whose routes encode cultural and ecological knowledge in sung form, are perhaps the most famous example. But similar traditions appear in the indigenous cultures of the Amazon, of Polynesia, of the Celtic world, and of ancient China, among others. In North America, the tradition of sacred geography is expressed in many ways. The vision quest tradition of the Plains peoples, in which an individual travels to a specific high or remote place to receive spiritual guidance, presupposes that certain places in the landscape have special spiritual power. The ceremonial center of the Chaco system was not arbitrarily located. It was positioned in a specific canyon in a specific relationship to the surrounding landscape that made it cosmologically correct according to the cosmology of the people who built it. The earthworks of the Hopewell culture were not built just anywhere. They were built at specific locations in the Ohio Valley that had particular relationships to the river, the hills, and the sky. What would it mean to understand the entire landscape of North America as a sacred text? What would it mean to interpret the distribution of ancient sites not as the random accumulation of opportunistic settlement, but as the deliberate inscription of meaning into geography? Some researchers have approached this question and found that the distribution of certain types of sites, when mapped at a large scale, shows patterns that are not obviously explained by practical factors alone. Ancient sacred sites in the eastern woodlands are not distributed randomly. They cluster in certain kinds of locations, at the confluences of rivers, on the tops of prominent hills, at the edges of geological features, in places where the landscape itself marks a transition or a threshold. These are the same kinds of locations that sacred sites occupy in other cultures around the world, which suggests that the people who chose these locations were operating from a cosmological framework that prioritized certain kinds of places for certain kinds of activities. The idea that North America has a sacred geography, a pattern of significant places distributed across the landscape in ways that encode cosmological meaning, is not a new one in indigenous tradition. It is fundamental to the worldview of many Native American cultures. What is less common is the attempt to map this sacred geography systematically and compare it to the distribution of the archaeological features we have been discussing in this telling. When you overlay the distribution of major Hopewell ceremonial sites with the topography of the Ohio Valley, you find that the sites cluster in specific kinds of landscape positions, not randomly distributed along the river, but concentrated at specific confluences and at points where the valley widens in ways that may have had cosmological significance. When you overlay the distribution of New England stone chambers with the topography of the region, you find a similar pattern, clustering in specific landscape positions rather than random distribution across the hill country. When you overlay the distribution of Pacific Northwest petroglyph sites with the coastal geography of British Columbia, you find consistent preference for certain types of locations, points, promontories, and places where two bodies of water meet. This consistent preference for specific types of landscape positions across different cultures and different regions and different time periods suggests that the choice of where to build or carve was not arbitrary. It was guided by a cosmological framework that identified certain kinds of places as appropriate for certain kinds of activities. And if that framework was widespread, if it influenced the placement of sites across a large portion of the continent, it would mean that the ancient sites of North America are not an accidental scatter of independent local decisions, but components of a larger pattern, a continental sacred geography that reflects a shared or widely distributed cosmological tradition. This is speculative. The evidence for it is pattern-based rather than direct. But patterns are what you find when you look at the data, without the pre-assumption that pre-Columbian North America was a mosaic of completely isolated local cultures with no continental-scale cultural coherence. The genetic evidence, as it continues to develop, is one of the most important tools for understanding the deep history of North American peoples. and it is producing results that are, to put it mildly, complicated. The comprehensive genetic analysis of ancient and modern indigenous North American populations is ongoing and has already produced significant revisions to the picture. What is now clear is that the modern indigenous peoples of North America are not genetically uniform. They do not all descend from a single founding population. The genetic diversity among Native American groups is substantial, reflecting multiple migrations, significant population movements within the continent, and possibly some degree of genetic contribution from sources that are not easily explained by the standard migration models. The most controversial piece of genetic evidence in the current literature is the presence of a genetic signal in certain populations that appears to connect them to populations in Australasia, meaning Australia and the nearby Pacific Islands, rather than to the Siberian source populations that are thought to have contributed to most Native American ancestry. This Australasian signal, which we mentioned briefly earlier, has now been documented in multiple studies using different genetic markers and different analytical approaches, and its presence in certain Amazonian populations is not seriously contested. What is contested is what it means. One interpretation is that a population with Australasian genetic ancestry crossed the Pacific at a very early date and reached the Americas before or alongside the main Bering migration. Under this interpretation, the Australasian signal in modern Amazonian peoples reflects the genetic contribution of this early Pacific crossing population, which was subsequently absorbed into the ancestral Native American population but left a detectable genetic trace. The timing suggested by the genetic data would place this crossing at somewhere between 13,000 and 40,000 years ago. Another interpretation is that the Australasian signal reflects a shared ancient genetic ancestry between the ancestors of both Australasian populations and certain Native American populations without requiring an actual crossing of the Pacific. Under this interpretation, both groups independently descended from the same ancient Eurasian population that diverged from the ancestors of other Eurasian peoples at an early date. The genetic community has not reached consensus on which interpretation is correct, and new data continues to be generated that might help resolve the question. But the existence of this genetic signal, whatever its ultimate explanation, is a reminder that the human history of the Americas is more complex than a simple story of people walking across a land bridge from Siberia would suggest. Let us talk now about a phenomenon that is specific to Canada and that has received almost no attention outside of the specialized literature. In the Ungava Peninsula of northern Quebec and in adjacent areas of northern Labrador, there are stone features that are unlike anything else in North America and that have never been satisfactorily explained. The features are called Inuksut or Inuksuk in the plural, though that word specifically refers to the human-formed stone figures that are the best-known type of stone feature in the Arctic and subarctic. What I am describing is a broader category of stone construction in the Ungava region that goes beyond the Inuksuk tradition and includes structures that are larger, more complex, and apparently older than the conventional Inuksuk tradition. The Ungava Peninsula was in historical times the territory of the Inuit and of earlier peoples who preceded them. The Dorset culture, which preceded the Thule culture that is the direct ancestor of modern Inuit, built distinctive stone structures that are found throughout the Arctic and subarctic. Dorset structures include small stone houses, meat caches, and figures made from stone and bone that include some of the most remarkable art produced by any culture in the pre-Columbian Arctic. But in the Ungava Peninsula specifically, there are stone features that predate the Dorset culture and that do not clearly fit within the known archaeological sequence for the region. Some of these are large circular stone enclosures whose function is not understood. Some are arrangements of standing stones on prominent ridges that may have astronomical significance. Some are low walls connecting high points that could have served as game drive systems, but on a scale that seems large for the relatively sparse game populations of the far north. The people who built these features are not identified in the current archaeological literature. They predate the Dorset culture, which arrived in the Ungava region approximately 2,500 years ago. They may represent an earlier Paleo-Eskimo tradition, but the material culture associated with the features has not been clearly linked to any known Paleo-Eskimo culture. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Ungava stone features is their geographic distribution. They appear to be more common in certain parts of the peninsula than others, and the areas of highest density correspond roughly to the areas that the local Inuit tradition identifies as places of special spiritual significance, places where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world is thin. Whether this correspondence is meaningful or coincidental is not clear. The Inuit tradition about these places predates in most cases any specific knowledge about the stone features themselves, which suggests that whatever quality made those places spiritually significant was recognized by both the makers of the stone features and by the later Inuit peoples who developed the tradition about them. This kind of continuity of place, significance across cultural discontinuities, is one of the more puzzling phenomena in the archaeology of sacred geography. When two completely unrelated cultures separated by hundreds or thousands of years independently identify the same locations as spiritually significant, something about those locations is doing the work. It may be landscape features, specific views, acoustic properties, the presence of certain mineral deposits, or something else entirely. But the continuity is real, and it suggests that the human perception of certain places as significant is not arbitrary, but reflects something in the places themselves. We should talk about the Serpent Mound, not the famous Serpent Mound in Ohio, which is well known, but the Serpent Mound in Ontario, which is less famous and in some ways more mysterious. The Ontario Serpent Mound, located near Peterborough, is a burial mound complex that includes a serpent-shaped earthwork approximately 60 meters long surrounded by several oval burial mounds. It is associated with the Point Peninsula culture, a late Archaic to early woodland period culture in the Great Lakes region, and it has been dated to approximately 2,000 years before the present. The serpent form is a significant motif in indigenous cultures across North America. The Great Serpent of the Ohio Serpent Mound is the most spectacular example, but serpent effigies appear in the burial traditions, the rock art, and the oral traditions of many North American cultures from different regions and different time periods. This widespread distribution of the serpent motif and the consistent association of serpents with water, with the underworld, and with supernatural power across many different cultural traditions suggests that the serpent as a symbol has very deep roots in North American cosmology. Roots that may predate the divergence of the specific cultural traditions in which it appears. The Ontario Serpent Mound is less famous than its Ohio counterpart, but it is remarkable in its own right. The serpent form is clearly intentional and clearly represents a significant investment of communal labor. The burial mounds associated with it contain human remains along with artifacts that suggest these were individuals of high status within their community. The combination of the effigy form with the burial function suggests that the mound complex had both cosmological and social significance, marking both the spiritual landscape and the social hierarchy of the community that built it. What is particularly interesting about the Ontario Serpent Mound in the context of our broader discussion is its location. It is near Peterborough, near the petroglyph site that we mentioned earlier, and near a concentration of other archaeological features in that region of Ontario that suggest the area was a place of special significance for the peoples who lived there. Whether the various archaeological features in the Peterborough region are connected to each other as components of a larger ceremonial landscape, or whether they represent independent activities of different periods has not been established, but the concentration of significant features in the same geographic area is suggestive. The deep history of the Great Lakes region, of which the Ontario Serpent Mound and the Peterborough petroglyphs are parts, is one of the most understudied areas of North American archaeology relative to its likely richness. The Great Lakes region was one of the most densely inhabited parts of the continent in the pre-Columbian period, supported by rich aquatic resources and productive forests. The copper deposits of Lake Superior were exploited by indigenous peoples going back at least 7,000 years in what is called the Old Copper Complex. One of the earliest metalworking traditions in the world, the Old Copper Complex is remarkable for several reasons. It predates bronze in the Old World by centuries, making it one of the earliest known instances of systematic metalworking by any human culture. The copper objects produced by Old Copper Complex craftspersons include a wide range of forms: spear points, knives, axes, fish hooks, awls, bracelets, rings, and other ornaments. The metalworking technique used, cold hammering of native copper, is technically simple compared to the smelting of copper ores practiced in the Old World, but it is effective and produces objects of considerable quality. The Old Copper Complex objects are found across a wide area of the Great Lakes region and beyond, transported by trade networks that spread copper from its source deposits near Lake Superior across hundreds of miles. Objects that appear to be Old Copper Complex products have been found as far south as the Gulf Coast and as far east as New England, suggesting trade connections of considerable extent. Who made the Old Copper Complex objects? The cultural affiliations of the Old Copper Complex within the standard archaeological sequence of the region are not fully established. The tradition appears in the archaeological record approximately 7,000 years ago and continues with variations for several thousand years. It does not clearly derive from any earlier technological tradition in the region, which has led some researchers to ask whether the knowledge of copper working was developed independently in the Great Lakes or whether it arrived from elsewhere. The question of independent invention versus diffusion. The question of whether similar technologies and ideas were developed independently in different places or transmitted from one place to another is one of the most contentious in the archaeology of North America. The standard assumption in North American archaeology has been one of independence, that the similarities between North American and Old World technologies and cultural practices are the result of independent invention rather than contact. But the genetic evidence for multiple migrations and the growing body of evidence for early maritime contacts is making the independence assumption harder to maintain across the board. For the Old Copper Complex specifically, the question of whether the knowledge of metalworking arrived in the Great Lakes region from elsewhere or was independently invented there is not settled. The technology is simple enough that independent invention is plausible, but the timing, the appearance of sophisticated metalworking in one of the earliest periods of documented complex cultural activity in the region raises at least a question. Let us go to the southwest one more time because there is a specific site there that deserves extended attention and that represents in concentrated form many of the themes we have been exploring throughout this telling. The Wupaki National Monument in northern Arizona is well known to visitors to the Colorado Plateau. Its cluster of large Pueblo ruins built by the Sinagua culture in the 12th and 13th centuries are dramatic structures that rise from the red rock landscape in ways that are immediately visually compelling. But within the monument, beyond the famous ruins, there is a feature that most visitors walk past without understanding what they are seeing. It is a blowhole, a crack in the sandstone that connects to an underground system of caverns and passageways. Wind moves through this underground system, creating strong air currents that emerge through the blowhole at ground level. The direction and strength of the air movement changes with atmospheric pressure, and the Sinagua people built a masonry enclosure around the blowhole that functions as a natural wind gauge, changing character with atmospheric conditions in ways that experienced observers could use to predict weather patterns. The blowhole is one feature of a site that taken as a whole suggests that the Sinagua chose the location of Wupaki not despite its unusual geological features, but because of them. The presence of the blowhole, the specific topography of the red rock landscape, the particular relationship of the site to the surrounding desert. All of these seem to have been factors in the choice of this specific location for a major ceremonial and residential center. And the astronomical alignments at Wupaki are consistent with the deliberate design that we see at Chaco. The main ruins are oriented in ways that suggest specific solar events were observed and incorporated into the design of the structures. The presence of a large ball court at Wupatki, connecting the site to a tradition of ball court construction that spread northward from Mesoamerica, links the site to a broader cultural world that extended far beyond the Colorado Plateau. Wupatki is not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a network of sites across the Colorado Plateau and the adjacent desert regions that were connected through trade, through shared architectural traditions, through shared cosmological frameworks, and through what appears to have been a significant degree of cultural interaction and exchange during the period between approximately 900 and 1300 CE. The collapse of this network in the late 13th century, which archaeologists attribute primarily to drought and possibly to social conflict, left the landscape dotted with abandoned ruins that continue to anchor the living traditions of the modern Pueblo peoples. We are approaching the very long end of this telling. Now, the evidence has accumulated across many regions and many time periods. The mystery has complexified with each site we have visited. The questions have multiplied faster than the answers. That is the nature of genuine inquiry into the deep past, and it is why the ancient history of North America continues to attract researchers, enthusiasts, and curious minds who cannot let the questions rest. Let me say a few things about what this inquiry is for and why it matters. First, understanding the deep history of North America matters because it is the history of human beings, and human history matters. The people who built the Newark earthworks and the New England chambers and the Hopewell trade network and the mounds of Louisiana were not primitive curiosities. They were fully modern human beings with the same cognitive capabilities, the same emotional range, the same capacity for creative and intellectual achievement as any other human beings who have ever lived. Their achievements deserve recognition on their own terms, not as curious exceptions to a general rule of New World backwardness, but as the genuine accomplishments of societies that solve the problems of their world in remarkable ways. Second, understanding the deep history of North America matters for the living people whose ancestors created it. The indigenous peoples of North America today are the cultural and biological heirs of the builders we have been discussing. Their traditions, their knowledge systems, their relationships to the land are continuous with the ancient heritage that the archaeological record documents. Acknowledging the sophistication and antiquity of that heritage is not just an academic exercise. It is a matter of basic human dignity. Third, understanding the deep history of North America matters because it challenges comfortable assumptions about what human beings are capable of and what conditions are necessary for high cultural achievement. The standard Western narrative of history tends to locate the highest human achievements in specific civilizations, specific geographic regions, specific cultural traditions. The evidence from ancient North America says that remarkable things can happen in many places and many times. That the capacity for sophisticated cultural achievement is not the exclusive property of any civilization or any region. And that the historical record is far more complex and far more interesting than any simple narrative can capture. And fourth, understanding the deep history of North America matters because the mysteries are real and they deserve to be taken seriously. Not because the most sensational alternative theories are necessarily correct, but because the anomalous evidence is real, the questions it raises are legitimate, and the pursuit of genuine understanding requires engagement with the full complexity of what the evidence shows rather than dismissal of everything that does not fit the established framework. The stones are patient. They will still be there after all the debates are settled and all the theories have been tested and the full story of who built them and why has finally been told. Until that time, they stand in the hills and the forests and the canyons of this continent, waiting for the light to come through the right passage on the right morning, performing the ceremonies their builders encoded in them, indifferent to the human arguments about what they are. That is probably the most important thing to remember. In the end, The stones were built to last, and they have. Whatever else is uncertain about the ancient history of North America, the endurance of the physical evidence is not. The evidence is here. It will continue to accumulate as new sites are found and new dating techniques are applied and new genetic analyses reveal new dimensions of the human story on this continent. And the story that is emerging slowly from all of this evidence is not the story we were taught. It is older, more complex, more connected, more sophisticated, and more interesting than anything the standard history books have ever suggested. It is the story of a continent that was not waiting to be discovered, but was already fully inhabited, fully inscribed with human meaning, fully integrated into the wider human world in ways we are only beginning to understand. That story is still being written. The stones are still being found. The oral traditions are still being recorded. The genetic analyses are still being processed. The astronomical alignments are still being calculated. And every year on the winter solstice, the light still comes through the passage of the chamber in Vermont and illuminates the stone at the back, performing its ancient function for whoever is there to see it, and for no one at all when no one comes. The ancient mystery of North America is real, and it is one of the most fascinating, unresolved questions in the entire human story. It deserves our attention, our curiosity, our rigor, and our respect for the people whose heritage it is. The stones are still there, and the light returns every year. There is one final thread we need to pull before this telling is truly complete. It is a thread that connects everything else, a common element running through every site and every culture and every mystery we have discussed. It is the question of why. Not who built these things, though that is fascinating. Not when they built them, though that matters deeply. But why? What drove human beings in so many different parts of North America, in so many different time periods, to invest extraordinary amounts of labor and knowledge into the construction of permanent stone and earth monuments oriented toward the sky? The practical argument says that astronomical knowledge was necessary for survival. Tracking the solstices and equinoxes tells you when to plant and when to harvest. Tracking the lunar cycle tells you when the tides will be most favorable for fishing. Tracking specific stellar events tells you when seasonal migrations will pass through your territory. All of this is true. The practical value of astronomical knowledge was real and significant. Building monuments to track celestial events was in this sense practical technology. But practical necessity alone does not explain the scale and the beauty of what was built. You do not need to build the Newark earthworks with their precise geometric forms covering 4 square miles to track the 18.6-year lunar cycle. You could track it with a series of stakes in the ground that would serve the same practical purpose with a fraction of the labor. The earthworks are not just tracking tools. They are expressions of something larger than practical necessity. They are, to use a word that sounds grand but is perhaps the right one, cosmological. They represent in physical form a vision of the universe and of humanity's place within it. The same is true of the New England chambers with their solstice alignments and the Chaco roads with their impossible straightness, and the Poverty Point earthworks with their concentric arcs, and the Chumash rock art with its astronomical encoding. These are not just practical tools. They are expressions of a worldview, a set of beliefs about the relationship between the human world and the wider cosmos made permanent in stone and earth. What was that worldview? We cannot know it in detail. We cannot recover the specific beliefs and practices associated with most of these sites because the traditions connected to them have been disrupted or lost. But we can infer the general contours from the physical evidence combined with what we know from the surviving oral traditions and from the broader comparative study of indigenous cosmology across North America. The general picture is of a world in which the human community and the natural world are not separate but continuous, in which the sky and the earth are in constant relationship, and the movements of celestial bodies have direct significance for human life. in which specific places in the landscape are nodes of special power or significance, where the relationship between the human world and other dimensions of reality is closer or more accessible, in which the proper maintenance of the world requires specific human activities, ceremonies, observances, constructions that ensure the continuity of the cosmic order. In this worldview, building a chamber that tracks the winter solstice is not just a practical matter of knowing when the days will start to get longer again. It is an act of cosmic maintenance. It is a participation in the drama of the years turning, an affirmation of the human community's relationship with the sun, an act of care for the world. The chamber does not just observe the solstice. It honors it. It participates in it. It marks the place where the human community chooses to stand in relation to the great recurring event of the sun's return from its southernmost point. This is a different relationship to the natural world than the one most modern Western people inhabit. It is a relationship of participation rather than observation, of membership rather than dominion. And it produced over tens of thousands of years of development, a landscape of extraordinary complexity and meaning that is still physically present across the entire continent of North America, still waiting to be fully understood. The ancient peoples of this continent built things that endure. They built them with knowledge, with care, with intention. They oriented them toward the sky because the sky mattered, because the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars were the framework within which all of life occurred. They built them in specific places because the land was not neutral geography, but a living text inscribed with meaning. And certain places in that text were more significant than others. What they built in stone and earth and accumulated knowledge was a civilization. Not in the narrow sense of cities and writing and bronze, the old world checklist for what counts as civilization, but in the deeper sense of a community of human beings who had developed over a very long time a sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of the world they lived in and their place within it, and who expressed that understanding in the construction of permanent things that would outlast individual human lives and carry the knowledge forward into the future. We are the future they built toward. We are the people who still live in the landscape they shaped and oriented and inscribed with meaning. And the question of what their legacy is and what we owe to it is not just an academic one. It is a question about how we inhabit this land and how we understand our own place in the long human story of the continent. The stones are patient. They have already been waiting longer than we know. They will wait a little longer while we figure out how to read them. And every year the light comes through the passage, and the ceremony continues in the stone chamber in Vermont, and in all the other chambers and mounds and earthworks and alignments scattered across the breadth of North America, performing their ancient and patient function in the landscape that is their home and ours. That is where the story rests for now, not where it ends, because it does not end, but where we leave it, in the stones and the light, in the patient, enduring, extraordinary legacy of the people who built these things and the land that still holds them. Let us sit with the mystery a little longer, because there are specific places and specific pieces of evidence that deserve to be named individually, to be given the weight of their particularity before this telling truly rests. In Woodstock, Vermont, there is a stone chamber that a farmer discovered beneath a collapsed hillside in 1979 while clearing land for a new fence line. The chamber was hidden under accumulated soil and forest debris to the point that it would have been invisible to anyone walking above it. When the soil was cleared away and the structure examined, it proved to be a sophisticated piece of construction. Dry-laid stone walls supporting a corbelled ceiling made from massive flat slabs. The whole thing approximately 12 feet long and sealed at one end by a stone slab that had to be removed for entry. On one of the interior walls, there were faint marks that might have been intentional incisions or might have been natural features of the stone surface. The marks have never been definitively analyzed. The chamber itself was dated by testing soil beneath the floor stones to an age consistent with pre-Columbian construction. The farmer who found it eventually filled it back in because it was on a part of his property he needed to use, and he had no way to protect it from visitors. That chamber is gone now, returned to the earth from which it briefly emerged. But it was there. It was real. It was old. And its story, the discovery, the examination, the disappearance, is itself a kind of parable for how ancient evidence disappears from the record. Not through malice usually, not through conspiracy, just through the ordinary pressures of people trying to live on land that the past also claims. In Groton, Connecticut, there is a standing stone that rises about 5 feet above the surrounding ground surface on a ridge above a small river. The stone is clearly not a natural feature. It is the wrong shape for glacial deposition and is positioned with its flat faces oriented in specific compass directions. The local historical society has documented it as a Native American feature without being more specific about its age or cultural affiliation. Nobody has dated it. Nobody has done a formal survey of its orientation or investigated whether it is part of a larger arrangement. It just stands there on the ridge, visited occasionally by people who know about it and ignored by everyone else. In Millington, New Jersey, there is a concentration of large boulders arranged in a pattern that has been noticed by several amateur researchers over the decades and that does not match any natural process of deposition. The boulders, which are each several tons in weight, are positioned in a rough ellipse on a hilltop with one particularly large boulder at the eastern end that has a flat upper surface bearing what might be a series of cut marks, small circular depressions that appear in megalithic traditions worldwide. The site has been surveyed informally multiple times and described in several self-published reports. It has never been formally investigated by professional archaeologists. In Williamstown, Massachusetts, there is a stone alignment that runs for several hundred yards along the base of a ridge, and that appears when measured with precision instruments to be aligned with the equinox sunset. The stones in the alignment are partially buried by soil accumulation and largely overgrown with moss and lichen, suggesting considerable age. Local historians have attributed them to a colonial farm boundary, but the orientation toward the equinox sunset is not consistent with any known colonial surveying convention and has never been adequately explained by the root cellar or agricultural clearing hypothesis. In the forests of the Catskill Mountains in New York, a researcher working systematically over several decades documented more than 60 stone chambers and hundreds of individual stone cairns distributed across the forested hillsides. The chambers range from simple single-room structures to more complex multi-chambered arrangements. Several have astronomically significant orientations. The researcher who published his findings in a small journal and in a self-published book calculated that the distribution of the chambers was not random, but showed patterns consistent with their having been placed in specific landscape positions for specific reasons. His work has not been incorporated into the standard archaeological literature for the region. These are not the famous sites. They are the ordinary sites, the unnamed and unnumbered and undated features that make up the bulk of the ancient material record in the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. For every America's Stonehenge, there are dozens of chambers and hundreds of cairns that nobody has given a name to, that no tourist has ever photographed, that no academic paper has described. They are the capillaries of the ancient landscape, the ordinary infrastructure of a culture that we are still trying to understand. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the ancient megalithic mystery of North America. It is not exceptional. It is ordinary in the best sense of that word. The sites we have discussed in this telling, from Poverty Point to the Newark earthworks to the New England chambers to the stone fish traps of British Columbia, were not isolated achievements by exceptional communities. They were part of a broader pattern of human engagement with the landscape that was widespread, sustained, and culturally deep. The pattern is still there in the ground, waiting to be fully mapped. The work of documenting and understanding it is one of the most important archaeological projects of the 21st century. Not because it will necessarily produce dramatic discoveries, though it might, but because it will fill in the picture of who was here, and what they did and how they understood the world in ways that enrich our understanding of the full range of human possibility. Every stone chamber in Vermont is a data point. Every medicine wheel on the northern plains is a data point. Every petroglyph on a Pacific coast cliff face is a data point. Every burial mound in the Ohio Valley is a data point. Together they describe a civilization, or more accurately a family of civilizations, that inhabited this continent for thousands of years and left a physical record of their presence that we are only beginning to read properly. That reading is the work of many generations. We are not at the end of it. We are at best somewhere in the middle. But the beginning of it, the moment when we started to take the anomalous evidence seriously, to look at the stones without the pre-assumption that they must be simple, to listen to the oral traditions without the pre-assumption that they are mythology, to consider the genetic evidence without the pre-assumption that it must fit the standard model. That beginning has happened. It is happening now in the work of researchers around the continent who are approaching the deep history of North America with the rigor and the openness that it deserves. The story that is emerging from that work is extraordinary. It is the story of a continent full of builders, astronomers, traders, navigators, farmers, artists, and thinkers who inhabited this land for a very long time, and who left their mark on it in ways that are still visible if you know how to look. The stones are their mark. The light through the chamber passage on the winter solstice morning is their gift. The mystery they left behind is their invitation. Come and look. Come and ask. Come and sit in the dark of the chamber and wait for the light to appear through the passage and travel across the stone floor and illuminate the back wall in the way it has done every year for thousands of years. And then ask yourself, not who built this, though that matters, but why? Why did they build something that would do this? Something that would perform this ceremony year after year, without anyone needing to be there to do anything? Why did they want the light to enter the darkness on the shortest day? What did that mean to them? The answer to those questions, when we find it, will tell us something important not just about the people who built the chambers but about ourselves. About why we find this beautiful. About why the light through the stone passage moves us in ways we cannot easily explain. About what we share with the people who stood in that chamber 4,000 years ago and watched the same phenomenon and felt something, some recognition of the world's order and their place within it, that made them want to build a monument to it. We are not as separate from them as the distance of millennia might suggest. They were people like us. They wondered about the same sky, watched the same sun, tracked the same seasons. They built things to last. And those things have lasted. And here we are, standing in the same chamber, watching the same light, feeling something that the distance of thousands of years has not been able to make strange. That is the deepest part of the ancient American mystery. Not the unanswered questions, as fascinating as those are, but the continuity, the unbroken line from the hands that placed those stones to the eyes that see them now. The persistent human need to mark the turning of the year, to make permanent what is fleeting, to build something that will outlast the individual life and carry the human moment into the future. The ancient builders of North America were doing what humans have always done in every time and every place. They were trying to make sense of the world and to leave a record of their understanding for whoever came after. We are whoever came after. The stones are still there. The light still comes, and the story continues. There is something that deserves to be said about the relationship between memory and stone. About why civilizations across time and across geography chose to encode their most important knowledge in rock, rather than in organic materials that could burn or rot or be eaten by time. Wood decays, bone crumbles, fiber dissolves, but stone endures in a way that nothing else quite matches. And the people who chose stone as their medium of record were not choosing arbitrarily. They were choosing permanence deliberately, with the knowledge that whatever they inscribed in stone would outlast not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they could imagine. The ancient peoples of North America understood this. The builders of the New England chambers understood that the stone would remain long after every person alive. The engineers of the Newark earthworks understood that the geometric forms they were cutting into the Ohio hillsides would still be there when their own great-grandchildren were dust. The carvers of the Peterborough petroglyphs understood that the marks they were making in the white marble bedrock would carry their message forward into a time they could not see or name. This understanding of stone as a medium of long-duration communication is one of the most profound things that the ancient builders of North America shared with megalithic builders around the world. It reflects a temporal awareness that we rarely attribute to ancient peoples, a consciousness of deep time, of the long span of years within which human lives are tiny and brief, but within which stone can serve as a constant. When you build something in stone with the intention that it will last, you are thinking across centuries. You are imagining people who will not know your language, who will not share your specific beliefs, who will live in a world changed beyond recognition, but who will still be able to perceive the stone arrangement and understand on some level that it was deliberate, that someone was here, that something mattered enough to mark. That is an extraordinary thing to think. That is a sophisticated relationship with time, and it was present in North America thousands of years ago in the cultures that built the enduring stone record we have been discussing throughout this telling. Consider what it means to build a chamber that aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. You are not just tracking an astronomical event. You are building a machine that will track it for you indefinitely into the future, that will perform the same demonstration year after year without any human intervention, that will show anyone who comes after you exactly where the sun rises on the shortest day of the year at this location on this hillside in this landscape. You are building a gift for the future, a demonstration of knowledge, a message across time. The message says several things at once. It says that the people who built this understood the movements of the sun. It says they valued that understanding enough to encode it in a permanent structure. It says they lived here in this specific landscape long enough and stably enough to build such a structure and orient it correctly. It says they had a community of labor that could quarry and transport and place the stones. And it says they believed that the future would contain people worth leaving a message for. That last implication is perhaps the most moving. When you build something designed to last 1,000 years, you are expressing faith in the future. You are saying that there will be people after you who will find this thing and understand it and value it. That your civilization, whatever it was, will leave a legacy worth receiving. The people who built these chambers in the hills of Vermont 4,000 years ago had that faith. And here we are 4,000 years later, standing in those chambers or reading about them, receiving the message even if we cannot yet fully decode what it says. The faith was justified. The future contained us, and we're trying to understand what they left us. That continuity, that unbroken thread from the hands that place those stones to the eyes that see them now, is one of the most quietly astonishing things about the ancient sites of North America. It is not dramatic in the way that the discovery of a treasure vault is dramatic, or spectacular in the way that a great pyramid is spectacular. It is quieter than that, and in some ways more profound. It is the ordinary miracle of stone persisting through time and carrying intention across the gap between the living and the dead. There is also something to be said about the relationship between these ancient sites and the night sky in a way that we have touched on repeatedly, but never fully dwelled upon. Because one of the things that unites the megalithic traditions of North America is not just the fact of astronomical alignment, but the specific character of the sky knowledge encoded in the sites. The builders of the Newark earthworks encoded the 18.6-year lunar cycle. The builders of the New England chambers encoded solstice and equinox events. The builders of the Bighorn medicine wheel encoded heliacal rise dates of specific stars. The Chumash encoded astronomical events in their rock art. The Chaco builders oriented their great houses towards solar events and used the sun dagger to track the solstice with extraordinary precision. What all of these have in common is that they are tracking cycles, not single events but recurring patterns. The sun rises at a different point on the horizon every day of the year and returns to the same point 1 year later. The moon's major standstill returns every 18.6 years. The heliacal rise of Aldebaran occurs at the same time relative to the seasons every year. These cycles are the fundamental rhythms of the sky, and the ancient peoples of North America track them with a consistency and a precision that reflects a deep investment in understanding the temporal structure of the cosmos. Why did this matter so much? Partly, as we have said, for practical reasons. Tracking the seasons means tracking the food. But the scale of the investment, the years of observation required to establish the lunar standstill cycle, the enormous labor required to build the Newark earthworks to encode it, goes beyond what practical necessity alone would motivate. You do not need 4 square miles of precisely geometric earthworks to tell you when to plant corn. You need them for something else, something that the practical explanation does not quite reach. The something else is meaning. The sky cycles are not just useful. They are meaningful in the specific sense that they provide a framework of order within which human life occurs and which human life can participate in. The sun does not rise at the same point every morning by accident. It follows a pattern that repeats with perfect regularity that can be predicted by anyone who has observed it long enough. That regularity is not just convenient. It is evidence of order, of something underlying the apparent chaos of experience that makes the world comprehensible and navigable, and in some fundamental sense trustworthy. Building monuments to track and honor those cycles is an expression of that sense of order and trustworthiness. It is a way of saying that the world is reliable, that the sun will return after the solstice, that the moon will complete its long cycle and begin again, that the stars will rise when they are supposed to rise and set when they are supposed to set. The monuments are an affirmation of cosmic order made permanent in stone. And the ceremony of watching the solstice light enter the chamber and illuminate the back wall is a participation in that order, a human act of alignment with the deep patterns of the universe. This is what the ancient sites of North America are at their core. They are not just archaeological curiosities or evidence for contested historical theories. They are expressions of a relationship with the cosmos that is profound, sophisticated, and deeply human. They are the product of minds that looked at the sky and saw meaning, that looked at the landscape and saw significance, that looked at the cycles of the sun and moon and stars and decided to build their understanding of those cycles into the earth in permanent form. That is a recognizable human impulse. We still feel it, the urge to make permanent what is meaningful, to build something that will outlast the moment, to leave a record for the future. The medium changes, the specific beliefs change, but the impulse is the same one that moved the hands that placed the capstones on the Vermont chambers 4,000 years ago. We are in this specific way their heirs, not in the sense of cultural descent necessarily, but in the sense of shared humanity. The same species, the same basic cognitive architecture, the same fundamental relationship to time and meaning and the desire to leave a mark. The ancient megalithic mystery of North America is ultimately a story about that shared humanity, about what people do when they have the time and the knowledge and the communal will to build something lasting, about how they choose to encode their understanding of the world in physical form, about the faith they place in the future when they construct something designed to endure beyond their own lifetimes. That story is still unfolding. The sites are still there. The research is still ongoing. The questions are still open. And the stones are still doing what they were built to do, tracking the light, holding the knowledge, waiting for us to finish understanding what they are trying to tell us. We are getting there slowly, imperfectly, with all the complications that genuine inquiry always involves. But we are getting there, and the light still comes through the passage every winter solstice. And the ancient ceremony continues. And somewhere in the hills of Vermont or the forests of New Hampshire or the river valleys of Ohio, a stone that was placed with intention thousands of years ago sits in its chosen position and waits with the patience that only stone possesses for the story to be fully told. It will be eventually. That is what stories do. They wait in the evidence until someone is ready to read them. The evidence is here. The readers are here. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.